Hey everyone, welcome back. Or maybe this is your very first time here, and if so, I am so glad you found your way. Get comfortable tonight, sink in a little deeper, let your shoulders drop. Because what I have for you is not a history lecture, it is a story. A quiet, fascinating, sometimes jaw-dropping story about ordinary people who lived in a world so different from ours that it almost feels like another planet. And yet, in the most human ways, they were exactly like us. Now, before we begin, I want to ask you something. Picture your morning, right now today. You wake up, the room is warm. You reach for your phone, maybe you shuffle to the kitchen, and within 4 minutes you have hot coffee in your hands. The lights come on with a tap. The water runs hot within seconds. Everything is exactly the way you left it the night before. Easy right, comfortable, almost automatic. Now, what if I told you that 500 years ago, in the same corner of the world we call England, a woman was already awake at 4 a.m, in complete darkness, kneeling beside cold ash blowing carefully on the faintest orange spark, trying to coax fire back to life with nothing but her breath and a handful of dried moss, no matches, no lighter, no electricity, no warm water waiting for her. Just silence, cold air, and the sound of the rest of the household still breathing in their sleep. And here is the part that really stays with me. This was not a bad day for her. This was just Tuesday. If this kind of story makes you want to stay up a little longer, if you love history that actually feels alive and close, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button and left a like before we go any further. Not because you have to, but because it genuinely helps more people find their way to stories like this one. And if you want to drop a comment below, maybe tell me where you are right now, what time it is, or what you are doing while you listen. I would honestly love to know. It makes this feel a little less like talking into the dark. Now, dim the lights if you can. Let the room get quiet and let us go back together into the very beginning of a Tudor morning. The year is somewhere around 1540. England is in the middle of one of the most turbulent centuries it has ever known. Henry VIII sits on the throne. The old church is crumbling. The new one is being built on top of it, brick by uncomfortable brick. The country is changing faster than most people can understand. But inside a modest English home, not a palace, not a grand manor, just a regular house belonging to a craftsman or perhaps a yeoman farmer, the morning begins the same way it always has, the same way it began before Henry, the same way it will begin long after him. It begins in the dark. Historians who have studied the daily rhythms of Tudor life tell us that ordinary working people rose well before sunrise, sometimes as early as 4 a.m, not because they wanted to, not because they were ambitious overachievers chasing their best life. They rose because daylight was everything. Before electricity, before gas lamps, before any kind of reliable artificial light that could flood a room brightly enough to work by, daylight was the only clock that mattered. Every hour of it was precious. Every minute of morning light was a minute of work, of production, of survival. You did not waste it sleeping. So the alarm, if you can even call it that, was simply the sky. The slow, cold, grey loosening of darkness at the horizon. And before that sky even began to change, the household had already started moving. Now here is something that surprises most people when they first learn it. In a typical Tudor home of any reasonable size, the very first person awake was not the mother. It was not the father. It was not even the oldest child. It was the servant. And if you were a live-in servant in a Tudor household, which many young men and women were starting as young as 12 or 13 years old, your day began before anyone else's ended. Your job, first thing before the family stirred, before a single candle was lit in the main rooms, was to bring the house back to life. That meant finding the fire. Let me paint this for you because it matters. The Tudor fireplace was not a decoration. It was not a cosy extra you switched on for ambiance on a cold evening. It was the centre of the entire home. It was heat light and the means of preparing every single thing the family would eat that day. When that fire went out overnight, the house did not just get cold, it became a different place entirely, dark still and carrying that particular kind of cold that settles into stone and wood and cloth after hours without warmth. The kind of cold that gets into your fingers before you're even fully awake. The servant's task was to scrape away the old grey ash, find the smallest surviving ember if one remained, and there was real skill in this, in reading the ash, in knowing where heat might still be hiding, and breathe it back to life. Carefully, slowly. With patience most of us have never needed for anything so simple. If no ember survived, then it was the fire steel and flint, striking sparks onto a small nest of dry tinder, watching for the faint, almost invisible catch of flame, guarding it with cupped hands against any draught from the window cracks. On a cold January morning, with numb fingers and sleep still sitting behind your eyes, this could take 10, 15, 20 minutes of careful, focused work. And all of this happened before anyone else even opened their eyes. By the time the family began to stir, the fire would be going. Barely maybe, but going. The room would have the first faint suggestion of warmth, and then the real rush began. Because here is something else the history books tend to gloss over. Tudor mornings were not quiet, peaceful affairs. They were organised chaos. In a household with children, servants, perhaps apprentices who also lived and worked under the same roof. And remember, this was incredibly common. Many craftsmen had 1 or 2 young apprentices sleeping in the house. The morning was loud, purposeful. Everyone had a job and everyone knew that the daylight was already counting down. Water had to be fetched. In most Tudor homes, this meant going outside, sometimes down the street to a well or a shared water source, and carrying it back in heavy wooden buckets. There were no taps. There was no running water. Every drop of water used in that house that day had been carried there by a person, usually a woman or a young servant on foot in whatever weather the English countryside had decided to offer that morning. And England, as you might know, does not have the most cooperative weather. Now, while all of this was happening, the fire, the water, the first sounds of the house waking up breakfast was being assembled. And I want to stop here for a moment, because the Tudor breakfast is one of those things that sounds simple until you really look at it. For most ordinary families in the 1540s, breakfast was not much, and that was entirely intentional. The morning meal was small and cold, leftovers from the night before if there were any. Perhaps some bread, though not the soft, fluffy, cloud-like bread we think of today. Tudor bread for common folk was dark, dense, and often made from rye or barley, with a texture closer to what we might call heavy farmhouse bread. It filled you. It did not delight you. There might be a small piece of hard cheese, maybe a boiled egg if the household kept hens and one had been laid, butter if the family could afford it, and to wash it all down beer. Not strong beer, not the kind you drink at a celebration. This was what the Tudors called small beer. A very mild, lightly fermented ale with an alcohol content so low it barely counted. It was consumed by everyone in the household, men, women, children, and yes, the 6-year-old at the table. Before you raise an eyebrow at that, and you should, because it is genuinely strange by our standards, here is why it made complete sense to them. Water was not safe to drink, not reliably. Wells could be contaminated, streams ran near waste, and without any understanding of germ theory, Tudor people simply knew from long experience that water sometimes made you sick, and beer almost never did. The mild fermentation process killed off enough of the bacteria to make it far safer than untreated water. So small beer was not a vice, it was a public health strategy. And honestly, starting your day with mild fermented barley and cold bread after hauling water uphill in the dark, I'm not sure I would complain. Here is something that stops most people cold when they hear it. For the nobility, the well-off families, the gentry, the people with servants doing all of the work we just described, breakfast was often skipped entirely, not because they were fasting, not because they were watching their figure, simply because they did not need it the way a labouring man did. They were not in the fields by 5 in the morning, they were not carrying water or breaking ice off the water trough or mucking out the animals before the sun came up. The historian Ruth Goodman, who has spent years living as the Tudors actually lived, sleeping in their beds, cooking their food, wearing their clothes, writes about this divide with real clarity. The labouring man rose at 4. He worked for 3 or 4 hours before he even ate. By the time he sat down for his first proper meal, he had already burned what most of us would consider a full morning's worth of energy. He needed those calories like a machine needs fuel. The nobleman, who rose perhaps at 6 or 7, attended morning prayers, was dressed by his servants and sat down to a leisurely midday dinner as his first real meal. Simply did not require the same fuel in the same way. Same country, same century, completely different mornings. But let us stay with the ordinary household for a moment longer, because I think it is where the most interesting story lives. By the time the full household was up and fed, and we're probably talking about 6 or 6:30 on a summer morning, a little later in winter the day's work had already begun in earnest. The woman of the house and I want to be very clear that this was almost always primarily her responsibility, had already started the process of preparing what would become the main meal later that day. Because in a Tudor kitchen, and we'll talk much more about that kitchen in a later part of this series, nothing was fast, nothing was instant. The main pot hanging from a hook over the fire might simmer for hours. The bread, if fresh bread was being made that day, had been started the night before and needed tending. Every single thing took time, and time, as we have already established, was the most precious resource in the entire house. There is one more piece of the Tudor morning I want to leave you with tonight, because it is the one that I find the most quietly extraordinary. Before any of this happened, before the fire, before the water, before the beer and the cold bread, there was prayer. Not optional prayer, not a moment of casual gratitude. Mandatory, structured, spoken aloud prayer, usually led by the head of the household, shared by everyone under that roof. In the Tudor world, the day did not simply begin when your body woke up. It began when you properly presented yourself to God and acknowledged that everything you were about to do, every fire you were about to light, every loaf you were about to bake, every field you were about to plough, all of it happened within a framework of faith that was as real and as physical to them as the floor beneath their feet. And here is what I think is so beautiful and strange about this at the same time. In a world with no alarm clock, no schedule, no phone buzzing on the nightstand, these morning prayers were in a very real sense the structure that held the day together. They mark the beginning, they set the intention, they gathered the household servants and family alike into a shared moment before the chaos of the day scattered everyone to their separate tasks. In some ways, they were doing something we have mostly lost. Not the religion necessarily, but the ritual, the deliberate pause, the communal acknowledgement that a new day had arrived and it deserved to be met with attention. I think about that sometimes in my own mornings. That first reach for the phone, still half asleep before my eyes are even properly open. There is something to be said for a world where the day started with your whole household gathered together speaking words out loud before a single task was touched. So that is where the Tudor morning begins, in darkness, in cold, in careful practiced work, in shared prayer, in small beer and dense bread and the smell of fire smoke just beginning to move through a house that had been cold and still all night long. It is humble, it is hard, and when you really sit with it, it is kind of remarkable. Because everything that came after that morning, every meal, every garment, every piece of furniture, every relationship, every rule that governed how people lived, it all flowed out of this. out of that one woman kneeling in the dark, breathing life into an ember. And the home she was waking up inside, that is where our story goes next. Because the Tudor house itself, the walls, the floors, the smells, the strange and surprising secrets hidden inside those timber-framed rooms, is a story all on its own. What was actually inside a Tudor home? What did it smell like, really? And what was hiding underneath those famous rush-covered floors that most people would rather not think about? Stay with me, we're just getting started. You are still here? Good. Because what comes next is the part that most history classes skip entirely. Not the wars, not the kings, not the treaties, but the actual physical walls of the world those people lived inside. And I want you to try something for a moment. Forget every image of a Tudor house you've ever seen on television. The warm amber light, the cosy beams, the perfectly arranged dried flowers hanging from the ceiling. Forget all of that. Because what I am about to describe is both more fascinating and considerably more aromatic than anything a film set has ever dared to show you. Let us start from the outside and work our way in. If you were travelling through the English countryside in, say, 1535, and you came upon a village of modest homes, the kind belonging to craftsmen farmers, small traders, what you would see first is what historians call the half-timbered house. Dark oak beams running vertically and horizontally, forming a kind of skeleton visible from the outside. And between those beams, panels of creamy white plaster filling in the gaps. It is genuinely beautiful in a spare and ancient way. Those black and white facades are some of the most photographed sights in England today. You can still find whole streets of them in places like Lavenham in Suffolk, or the Shambles in York, where the upper floors lean out so far over the street that neighbours across the lane could practically shake hands from their windows. But here is what that striking image does not tell you. Those walls were made of wattle and daub, which sounds almost charming until you learn what it actually means. The process began with thin branches, usually hazel woven between the timber posts like an enormous basket. Then workers applied the daub, a mixture of wet clay straw and horse dung, sometimes cattle dung, mixed together, pressed into the woven branches with bare hands smoothed over and left to dry. The finished product was then painted with lime wash, that brilliant white you see in the photographs. And it worked. It kept the cold out reasonably well. It held together for decades if properly maintained. But it also cracked. It absorbed moisture. And on a wet English day, of which there are many, the smell of those walls when the rain came through was particular. I want to be fair to the Tudors here because they were absolutely not oblivious to this. They plastered and replastered, they painted and repainted, they filled the cracks when they appeared. Maintaining the fabric of the house was constant ongoing work, mostly for women, mostly unrecorded in any official document, mostly invisible to history. But invisible does not mean it did not happen. Now step inside. The first thing that strikes you, and this is something almost every modern person misses, is how dark it is. Not dim. Not cosy dim, dark. For most Tudor households, the windows were not glass. Glass was extraordinarily expensive throughout the 16th century. It had to be imported often from Italy or the continent, and the cost put it firmly beyond the reach of ordinary families. What the poor had instead were wooden shutters or sometimes panels of oiled linen stretched across the window frame. These let in a little light, a pale, diffuse glow like looking through wax paper. It cut the wind. It kept out most of the rain, but it did not light the room. Here is how significant this was when a wealthy Tudor family in the late 1500s moved to a new house. They took their glass windows with them, physically removed them, carefully packed them, and reinstalled them at the new property. Glass windows were not considered part of the house the way we think of them now. They were personal property, furniture, something you owned and carried. The grand houses of the truly wealthy were in contrast almost shocking in their use of glass. Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, built in the 1590s for the formidable Bess of Hardwick, became famous almost immediately for its enormous windows, so much glass that a saying grew up around it: Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall. The house was designed to be seen from a distance, lit from within by candles at night, like a lantern on a hillside. It was not just beautiful, it was a deliberate, extravagant announcement of wealth. Most people, of course, lived nowhere near Hardwick Hall. So how did an ordinary Tudor family light their home after dark? This is where things get interesting and a little sad. The cheapest option was the rushlight. The word itself is almost quaint, but the reality was grim. You took dried rushes, the same plants that grew in marshes and along riverbanks, stripped off most of the outer skin to leave a thin core, soaked them in animal fat, and then clamped them at an angle in a little iron holder. When you lit one, it burned with a thin wavering flame for about 20 minutes. That was it. 20 minutes of real light. Then darkness again unless you lit another. Think about what that actually means for an evening. If you wanted to sew or read or mend something, if you were lucky enough to be able to read at all, you needed a continuous supply of rushlights. The cost added up quickly. So Tudor households did something we have almost entirely forgotten. They shared their light. Neighbours would gather in one house, pooling their candles and rushlights in a single room, so that everyone could work by the combined glow. Several women sewing together perhaps, or a group of men repairing tools. Not just for company, though, the company mattered too. But because light was literally a resource, you rationed and shared the same way you might share water during a drought. There is something about that image I find unexpectedly moving. 6 women gathered around a single candle in the dark, needles flashing in and out of cloth voices, low the fire sending shadows up the wall. It is entirely foreign to the way most of us live now, alone in lit rooms in houses full of switches. And yet it is also somehow deeply familiar in the way that any human gathering against the dark feels familiar. Now let's talk about the floor, because this is the part that everyone asks about when they learn it. For most Tudor homes, the ground floor was simply earth. Packed down, yes, smoothed over, sometimes treated with white clay, but earth. No stone, no tile, no wood planks. Just the ground beneath your feet with a thin layer of something on top. That something was rushes. Fresh rushes gathered from river banks and marshes were spread across the floor in a layer several inches thick. They were fragrant when new, a faint green cucumber-like smell that is actually quite pleasant. They provided insulation from the cold ground. They were springy underfoot, and they had an almost magical ability to absorb things, all sorts of things. A Venetian diplomat visiting England in 1513 wrote back to his government describing the floors of English homes. He noted that fresh rushes were laid every 8 to 10 days. That seemed reasonable enough to him. What he perhaps did not mention, and what the Dutch scholar Erasmus was considerably less diplomatic about, was what happened in the layers below. Erasmus visited England around 1520, and he had a lot of thoughts. He wrote to a friend describing the floors of English rooms as being usually of clay strewed with rushes, under which lies unmolested an ancient collection of beer grease fragments, bones, spittle, and everything that is nasty. Now, I want to be fair again. The historian Ruth Goodman, who has actually lived as the Tudors lived, sleeping on rush floors, cooking at open fires, wearing the same linen for weeks, makes a compelling argument that Erasmus was, to put it kindly, the kind of traveller who complained about everything that was not Dutch. In her own experiments living on rush-covered earth floors, she found that the rushes worked remarkably well. Things dropped between them simply disappeared downward, drying out and composting rather than rotting or smelling. The bottom layer of old rushes she eventually removed was dry, fibrous, and did not smell nearly as bad as Erasmus suggested. So the truth, as usual with history, probably sits somewhere between the disgusted foreign visitor and the enthusiastic modern historian who wanted to prove him wrong. The rush floor worked. It was not the horror show Erasmus described, but it was also not a surface most of us would feel entirely comfortable sitting on with our shoes off. And here is something nobody tells you about the Tudor house interior. The carpets were on the walls. If a Tudor family owned a carpet, and most did not because carpets from Turkey and Persia were extraordinarily expensive luxury items, they almost certainly did not put it on the floor. They hung it, on the wall or draped over a table or across the back of a chair. Carpets were displays of wealth meant to be seen and admired, not walked on and ruined by muddy shoes and scattered rushes. When Henry VIII died in 1547, an inventory was made of his possessions. He owned over 800 carpets. 800. Most of them were never on any floor. They were hung, folded, stored, displayed. They were statements. Meanwhile, in the long gallery at Hardwicke Hall, that showpiece of Elizabethan architecture, that palace of glass and ambition, the floor was still covered with simple rush matting. Even at the very top of English society, the notion of walking on a precious carpet was considered almost wasteful. Let us talk for a moment about what a room actually contained, because this is where the Tudor house surprises people most. We tend to imagine historical homes as cluttered full of dark furniture and heavy drapes, but an ordinary Tudor room was almost spare by modern standards. A table, stools, not chairs. Chairs were expensive and prestigious enough that in many households only the head of the family sat on one. Everyone else got a stool. Servants definitely got a stool. Children got a stool. Visitors of insufficient status got a stool. The distinction mattered enough that the expression taking a chair, meaning to sit in a position of authority, entered the language in this period and never really left it. Every time you say the chair of a committee or chairman, or even just ask someone to take a seat, you're reaching back to a world where what you sat on told everyone else in the room exactly who you were. The walls, meanwhile, were either bare or hung with painted cloths, cheap alternatives to the tapestries that wealthy households used. These cloths served multiple purposes simultaneously. They added a little colour to what would otherwise be a very dim plaster and timber room. They provided some insulation keeping draughts from whistling through cracks in the wattle and daub, and they were in their own modest way decorative, evidence of a household that cared about its appearance. Oak panelling, the warm, dark carved wood we associate with Grand Tudor interiors, was also primarily about keeping the cold at bay. A panelled room was a warmer room. The wood sat several inches from the outer wall, creating a small air gap that acted as rudimentary insulation. It was practical and beautiful at once in the way that the best Tudor design often was. There is one more thing about the Tudor house I want you to sit with. Privacy did not exist inside it, not as a concept, not as something people expected or wanted or even had a word for in the way we use it now. The single most radical thing that happened to the English home during the 16th century was not the introduction of glass windows or chimneys, or even better furniture. It was the invention of rooms, specifically the separation of the house into spaces with different purposes, and the idea that some of those spaces might be for one person or a small group rather than for everyone at once. Before this period, the great hall of a house was everything. You ate there, slept there, received visitors there, argued there, grieved there. Everyone from the master of the house to the lowest kitchen boy shared the same space. Privacy was not expected and not particularly desired. Being alone, in fact, was slightly suspicious. Why would you want to be alone? What were you doing that required solitude? The 16th century began to answer that question. Slowly, hesitantly, one room at a time, the parlour appeared a smaller room off the main hall where the family might withdraw for a more private conversation. the withdrawing room which eventually became what we call the drawing room. Even the idea of a separate bedroom, a space specifically for sleeping, rather than for everything else, was a new luxury filtering slowly downward from the nobility to the merchant class to eventually ordinary craftsmen and their families. The house was learning to breathe, learning to have its own internal geography, its own sense of here and there, this room and that room. But in most Tudor homes throughout most of the century, all of that was still just beginning. The walls were new, the rooms were shared, the darkness was real, and the family servants and children and husband and wife moved through all of it together in ways we would find suffocating and they would find entirely natural. I have a question for you, actually. Think about your home right now, the room you are in, the privacy of it, the light, the insulation from the weather outside. Think about everything that has been added to the idea of home in the 500 years since a Tudor family huddled around a tallow candle on a rush-covered floor. How much of what you think of as basic, as simply the minimum for human comfort, would have seemed like unimaginable luxury to a craftsman's wife in 1540? Almost all of it, I think. Almost all of it. The walls held secrets. The floor held memories and fragments, and the accumulated record of daily life in a way no written document could. And tucked into the heart of that house, dark, warm, smoky, and endlessly busy, was the room that made everything else possible. The kitchen. What happened inside it would test the limits of what you think cooking even means. Because feeding a Tudor household was not a skill. It was an art form, a physical endurance event, and occasionally a genuine act of survival all at the same time. Stay with me. The fire is already going. Somewhere between the dark rooms and the rush-covered floors, between the wattle and daub walls and the tallow candle burning down to nothing after 20 minutes, there was a room that held the whole household together. Not the parlour, not the bedroom, not even the great hall where the family gathered in the evenings, the kitchen. And whether you're thinking of a royal palace or a one-room farmhouse in the English countryside, the kitchen in Tudor England was never just a room where food was prepared. It was in the most literal sense the engine of everything. The source of warmth, of smell, of sound. The place where the calendar lived, because what you cooked changed entirely, depending on the season, the church calendar, the weather, and what you could afford that particular week. Let us go inside. The first thing you need to understand is scale. Not because the numbers are impressive in themselves, though they are, but because the contrast between one end of Tudor society and the other is so extreme that it genuinely changes how you understand everything else. At one end of that spectrum sits Hampton Court Palace. Henry VIII acquired Hampton Court from Cardinal Wolsey in 1529, and one of the first things he did was expand the kitchens, quadruple them actually. By the time he was finished, the kitchen complex occupied 55 separate rooms covering 3,000 square feet, staffed by 200 people working in 19 distinct departments. There was a great kitchen for roasting meat, a separate boiling house, a pastry room, a confectionery, a spicery, a dairy, a wet larder for fish, a dry larder for grain, a flesh larder for meat, and 3 separate wine and ale cellars. Every room had a specific function. Every function had its own team of specialists. Those kitchens burned between 6 and 8 tons of seasoned oak wood every single day. Every day, not for warmth, for cooking. That wood was consumed entirely in producing 600 to 800 meals twice a day every day. The court was in residence. By comparison, the Elizabeth I household provisioning records tell us that in a single year at Hampton Court, the kitchens processed 1,240 oxen, 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, 760 calves, 1,870 pigs and 53 wild boar. Read that again. 53 wild boar in 1 year, just from one palace. There is something almost vertiginous about those numbers, the sheer mechanical weight of production, the scale of organised human effort required just to keep one monarch fed and his court satisfied. When a Spanish ambassador visited the kitchens during Henry's reign, he reportedly described them as a hellish place, relentlessly hot, chaotic, and running, as he put it, on copious amounts of beer, which, as we have already established, was more public health strategy than indulgence. But still, here is something almost no one knows about Henry's kitchens. There were no women in them. Not one. All 200 staff were men. The cooking of royal food at that scale, the heavy lifting, the brutal heat, the hours-long physical endurance of working directly over enormous open fires was considered exclusively male labour in that context. Which creates a wonderful irony, because outside the palace walls in every ordinary Tudor household across England, cooking was almost entirely the domain of women. Same act, completely different world. Now step down from the palace and into the home you and I have been living in throughout this story. The modest house of a craftsman or a yeoman farmer. Here the kitchen is not 55 rooms. In the early part of the century it is not even a separate room at all. For most of English history before the Tudors, and for poor household well into the 16th century, the kitchen was the home. A single room, or perhaps two at most. The fire burned in the centre of the main space or against one wall, and it served every purpose, simultaneously cooking heat, light drying wet clothes, warming cold hands. Everything and everyone circled around it. The chimney changed this. The Tudor period, as we touched on when we spoke about the house itself, is when chimneys became practical and relatively common. The shift from round to square design lined with fireproof clay allowed smoke to draw out reliably instead of hanging in a permanent grey fog at eye level. This made it possible to divide the house, to have a room on one side of the chimney for sitting and sleeping, and the other side for cooking. The birth of the domestic kitchen as a distinct space. But even with that separation, the Tudor kitchen was nothing like what most of us think of when we hear the word. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a kitchen. Counter space, oven, stove with controlled burners, a refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, running water from a tap, a sink with drainage, knives stored in a block, everything organised, everything at your fingertips. You can turn the heat up or down with a precise dial. You can look inside the oven through a glass window without opening it. If something starts to go wrong, you turn a dial and it stops. Now take all of that away. What remains? Fire. One fire. An open hearth, a single source of heat you cannot precisely control. Too close and the food burns. Too far away and it barely cooks. There is no medium setting. There is no temperature gauge. There is only your experience, your judgment, your hands, and the constant focused attention of someone who has been doing this since childhood. The primary cooking vessels were iron pots and cauldrons suspended over the fire from hooks and chains. You could raise or lower them to adjust how directly they sat above the heat, which was the main way of controlling cooking temperature. Slow simmering was easier than precision roasting. Soups and pottages, the thick grain and vegetable broths that formed the backbone of the ordinary Tudor diet, were relatively forgiving of this imprecision. Roasting meat was not. Which brings us to one of the strangest and most unexpectedly moving stories of the entire Tudor kitchen, the turnspit dog. Roasting meat over an open fire requires constant rotation. The joint needs to turn slowly, evenly, continuously, so that all sides receive equal heat and the fat bastes the meat as it renders. Before the turnspit dog, this job fell to a human being. Specifically a spit boy, usually a young male servant, one of the lowest-ranking members of any household, with pretensions to proper roasting. His job was to sit beside the fire, often for hours at a time, turning the handle of the iron spit by hand. The heat was punishing. The work was relentless. Records suggest that spit boys regularly suffered blisters, burns, and the particular misery of being overheated while still needing to work without stopping. At some point in the early 16th century, someone looked at this problem and thought, what if the dog did it? The result was a breed specifically developed for the purpose. The turnspit dog, sometimes called the kitchen dog or by its Latin name Canis vertigus, was bred small, low to the ground, long-bodied with short, crooked legs, perfectly suited to running inside a large wooden wheel mounted on the kitchen wall. The wheel was connected by a rope or chain to the spit in front of the fireplace. As the dog ran, the wheel turned, the spit rotated, and the meat cooked evenly. The English physician John Caius first described the breed formally in a book published in 1570, though the dogs were clearly in use before his account. By 1750 they were reportedly everywhere in English kitchens. In households that could not afford one, they kept two, and rotated them in shifts, which some historians believe is the actual origin of the phrase, "every dog has his day." On their one official day off each week Sunday, the dogs were not left at home. They were taken to church. Not out of religious feeling on anyone's part, but because Tudor church pews were cold and draughty, and a warm dog placed across cold feet was a practical luxury. The same creature that had spent 6 days running in a wheel over a fire was spending its Sunday serving as a living foot warmer in a church pew. I find this detail almost unbearable in the way that only true stories manage to be. The turnspit dog is now extinct. By the mid-19th century, mechanical spit turners had replaced them. The breed, never considered beautiful or companionable, simply faded without anyone thinking to preserve it. Owning a turnspit dog after the mechanical alternatives became available became, according to one period account, a stigma of poverty. These animals, who had served English kitchens for 300 years, ended their time on earth as symbols of backwardness. There is something there about utility and gratitude and the things we discard when they are no longer convenient. But perhaps that is a thought for the quiet hours after this story ends, back to the kitchen itself, and the question that matters most for an ordinary family's survival: how did they keep food from spoiling? No refrigerator, no freezer, no sealed plastic, no preservatives beyond those that occurred naturally in the process of preparation itself. The answer was salt and smoke and time. Salt was the single most important preservative in the Tudor household, and its value cannot be overstated. Every autumn, as the weather turned cold, a family that kept any livestock at all had to make a brutal calculation: which animals to keep alive through the winter, which ones to breed in spring, and which ones to slaughter now. Because feeding animals through a cold English winter was expensive, and an animal you could not feed was an animal that would die anyway. Better to slaughter it while the meat was still good and preserve it than to lose both the animal and the food. The chosen animals were killed, the meat cut into pieces and then packed heavily in dry salt or submerged in strong brine. Barrels of salted pork, barrels of salted fish, smoked hams hanging from the rafters of the kitchen or in a dedicated smokehouse if the household was large enough to have one. This is why winter food in a Tudor household tasted so profoundly different from summer food. Not just a different range of vegetables, but a completely different texture and flavour profile to the meat. Heavily salted, deeply smoked, dense, with a concentrated richness of preservation. Tudor recipes contain endless instructions for soaking salted meat in multiple changes of water before cooking precisely, because it had been preserved so aggressively that the salt had to be drawn out before the dish was edible. For wealthier households there was another option. In late winter, ice and packed snow were gathered and stored in underground ice cellars, pits dug into the earth lined with straw and wood for insulation. A well-built ice cellar could keep its contents frozen from February through to late summer. These were not ordinary household features. They were infrastructure available only to estates and wealthy farms with the labour and resources to dig and maintain them. But they existed, and they worked, and the people who had access to them ate noticeably better, fresher food than their neighbours through the warmer months. For everyone else, you cooked what was in season, you preserved what you could afford to preserve, and you ate around the edges of scarcity with the creativity that necessity always produces. Here is something that genuinely surprised me when I went deep into the history of Tudor kitchens: the food adulteration problem. We tend to assume that food fraud is a modern concern, something born of industrial-scale production and profit motive and the distance between farm and table. But Tudor England had a significant and documented food fraud problem that reads in some ways uncomfortably like headlines from today. Sugar was commonly adulterated with gypsum and plaster of Paris. Butter frequently had lard added to extend its volume. Bread bakers were known to add chalk or other white powders to their flour to increase the weight and whiteness of the loaf. Even ale, that indispensable staple of Tudor life, could be weakened, diluted, or flavoured with substitutes that were not what they appeared. One of the more poignant examples, certain cheeses were treated with red lead to improve their colour and make them look more appealing. Lead, applied to food intended for human consumption, not out of malice but out of ignorance and out of economic pressure, because a seller who could make an ordinary cheese look like a premium cheese could charge more for it. This is where the guilds served a genuinely important purpose: bread weight, meat quality, ale strength. These were all regulated and inspected in ways that were remarkably consistent for a pre-industrial society. The baker who shorted the weight of his loaves faced public humiliation, sometimes being dragged through the streets with the underweight bread tied around his neck. The ale that failed inspection was poured into the street. Crude enforcement, but enforcement nonetheless. I want to end this part of the story somewhere close and particular, because I think the grand numbers, the 6 tons of wood, the 53 wild boars, the 200 palace staff can make it easy to lose sight of what cooking actually felt like for the woman standing at an ordinary fire on an ordinary afternoon. She's maybe 30 years old. She's been cooking in this kitchen, or one very like it, since she was old enough to be useful. Her hands know the weight of the pot, the heat of the fire at different distances, the smell that tells her the pottage needs more water, the colour of fat in the pan that says the temperature is right. There is no recipe written down anywhere, because she does not need one. This knowledge lives in her body, not on a page. Outside the afternoon is grey. The children are somewhere. Her husband will be back before the light fails completely. She has salted pork soaking since this morning, and the dried peas she put on 2 hours ago are starting to thicken properly. It is by any measurable standard relentless work. It is also in its own particular way a kind of mastery. That mastery fed a family. Day after day, season after season, year after year, without appliances, without recipes, without any of the countless things we lean on so completely that we've forgotten we are leaning on them at all. There is a question worth sitting with. What do you think about when you cook? What does your mind do while your hands are busy? Because in a Tudor kitchen where every task demanded sustained physical presence and sensory judgment, the mind could not really wander. The fire demanded attention. The pot demanded attention. The salt levels, the timing, the temperature, the preservation, all of it demanded the same focused presence that we, in our more automated kitchens, rarely need to summon anymore. I'm not sure that was worse. I am genuinely not sure. But the kitchen, as extraordinary as it was only one corner of the story, because feeding the family was only one of the 1,000 things this household had to manage every single day. And the person at the centre of almost all of it, the one whose labour made the whole machinery of domestic life run, was someone history barely bothered to write down. What did a year actually look like for the woman of a Tudor house? Not the queen, not the noble woman with her ladies-in-waiting and her embroidery afternoons, but the woman who woke before everyone worked while others slept, and whose name never appeared in any official record. That story is the one we are going into next, and I promise you, it is not what you expect. Let me tell you about a woman whose name we do not know. She was probably born sometime in the 1510s or 1520s, in a village or market town somewhere in the middle of England. Her father was perhaps a craftsman, a tanner, a carpenter, a blacksmith. She learned everything she needed to know from her mother, the way girls did not from books because she likely could not read, but from watching, from doing, from the slow accumulation of skill that happens when you spend your childhood standing beside someone who already knows how things work. By the time she was 17 or 18, she married. A man her parents approved of, someone respectable, someone with a trade or a parcel of land. Whether she loved him is a question the historical record does not answer. Whether love was even the right frame for how she understood her life at 17 is a question worth sitting with. She moved into his house, and then the work began. Not some of it, not part of it, all of it. The reason history has so little to say about ordinary Tudor women is not because they were not doing anything. It is almost the opposite. They were doing so much in so many directions at once that the people who kept records, the guild secretaries, the court clerks, the parish administrators, all men simply did not think to write any of it down. It was domestic, it was female, it was by the logic of the age invisible, but the work itself was not invisible to anyone who lived inside a household and depended on it to function. Remove the woman from the equation, and within a week the household begins to collapse. The food runs out, the linen goes unwashed, the medicine cabinet, and yes, there was a medicine cabinet of a kind, goes untended, the animals go unfed. The fire, that same fire we talked about at the very beginning of this story, goes cold and stays cold. The historian Alison Sim, who wrote one of the most thorough accounts of daily life for Tudor women, puts it simply: most men in the 16th century could not run a farm or a business without their wife's help. Not without difficulty. Without her, the enterprise simply did not function. So let us follow her through a year as honestly as we can. The year for a Tudor housewife did not begin in January. Not really. It began whenever the work demanded, which was always, and it followed the rhythms of the agricultural calendar rather than anything on a Roman-derived chart of months. But let's say it is spring, April or May. The worst of the cold has loosened its grip, and the household has survived another English winter, which is no small thing because winter in the 16th century was genuinely dangerous for people without adequate food or fuel. The Little Ice Age. A period of unusually cold temperatures that persisted across Europe from roughly 1300 to 1850 meant that winters in Tudor England were colder and harder than anything most of us have experienced. The Thames froze hard enough in some years for fairs to be held on its surface. Getting through to spring was an achievement. So spring arrives. The salted meat from the autumn is nearly gone. The dried beans and peas stored in the larder are running low. But the garden is waking up, and this is her domain as much as anyone's. The garden behind a Tudor farmhouse or craftsman's home was not decorative. It was utilitarian in the way that a car is utilitarian. It was a tool, and its output contributed directly to whether the family ate well or barely. She grew onions, leeks, parsnips, cabbage. She grew the herbs that would flavour the year's cooking: rosemary, thyme, sage, parsley, marjoram. And she grew the herbs that she would use as medicine, because in a world where the nearest physician might be miles away and charge more than a labourer earned in a week, the housewife was the family doctor. Full stop. This is the part of Tudor women's history that genuinely surprises people when they encounter it. The expectation of medical knowledge, practical, botanical and applied, was not optional. It was written into the very concept of what it meant to run a competent household. Cookbooks and household manuals of the period, the few that survive, devote entire chapters to remedies. What to do for a fever, for a cough, for a wound that will not close for the aches and swellings of winter joints. The woman of the house was expected to know all of this by heart, and to act on it confidently when the need arose. She kept bees in many households because honey was both a sweetener and a preservative, and had been used as a wound dressing since antiquity. She dried flowers for poultices. She knew which plants brought fever down, and which ones should never be given to a pregnant woman. This knowledge was passed mouth to mouth, generation to generation, embedded so deeply in domestic practice that most of it was never written down at all, which means most of it has also been lost. By summer, the tempo of the household shifts. The brewing begins in earnest, and this is a task worth pausing on because it was far more central to the Tudor household than the word brewing might suggest to a modern ear. Before the professional commercial breweries became dominant later in the period, brewing was primarily a domestic activity, and it was primarily done by women. The word alewife, a woman who brewed and sold ale, was not an insult or a curiosity. It was a profession, a real one. Evidence from medieval and early Tudor records shows that women produced the majority of the ale consumed across England in small batches from their own homes or yard sheds, and often sold the surplus to neighbours and passing travellers. Brewing required skill, patience, and the management of an organic process that could go wrong in a dozen ways. You needed to malt the grain, germinate it, then dry it before grinding it, mixing it with hot water, adding whatever flavouring you were using. Hops were not universal yet in the early Tudor period. Other plants and herbs were common, and then managing the fermentation carefully enough that the result was drinkable rather than sour or dangerous. All of this happened in the same space where cooking was already ongoing, with fire as your only heat source and your nose as your primary quality control instrument. She did this perhaps every week or 2 weeks, producing enough to keep the household supplied. Because as we have already established, the ale was not a luxury, it was the water. But brewing and gardening are almost the gentle parts of the summer calendar, because running alongside all of this, braided through every other task like a thread that never stops, was the textile work. Spinning, weaving, sewing, mending. In the early Tudor period, before the wool trade became fully commercialized and factory-produced, cloth became widely available. Most ordinary families either produced their own cloth or bought raw fibre and processed it at home. Spinning was so universal a female occupation that it gave us a word we still use today, spinster, which originally meant simply a woman who spins. Not a pejorative, not a comment on marital status, just a description of what women did, and they did it constantly. The distaff, the stick that held the unspun fibre while the spindle twisted it into thread, was so synonymous with women's work that it became a shorthand for anything on the female side of a household. The distaff side of a family still appears in genealogical writing. We've entirely forgotten what it means, but the word survives hollow and polite from a world where a woman's hands were almost never still. A Tudor woman spun while she talked. She spun while the bread baked. She spun in the evening when the light was just barely enough to see by. The thread she made became cloth. The cloth became shirts shift, bedding the practical fabric of daily life. And when something wore through or tore, and everything wore through eventually in a household where clothing was mended rather than replaced, she repaired it. Here is something that stops people: the phrase pin money, which we use today to mean spending money for small personal purchases, comes directly from the Tudor period. Women literally needed money to buy pins, sharp little brass or steel pins, used to hold together the many layers of their own clothing, since buttons and fastenings were expensive and pins were the primary means of keeping a garment assembled. A woman without pin money was, in a fairly immediate physical sense, a woman whose dress might come apart during the day. The expression entered the language from a material reality that no longer exists, and became metaphor long before anyone remembered what it originally meant. Autumn is when the heaviest labour concentrates, the harvest, the slaughter, the preservation. We talked about some of this in the context of the kitchen, the decision of which animals to keep and which to salt, but from the woman's perspective it goes far beyond that. Because everything that comes off the farm or out of the garden in autumn needs to be processed, stored or transformed before winter makes fresh food unavailable. Pickling, jellies, preserves, drying herbs, rendering fat, making candles from tallow for the dark months ahead, making soap in some households from the ash of the fire and the fat of the slaughter. The autumn was a race against the calendar, a sustained sprint of productive work that had to be finished before the cold set in, and the days shortened past usefulness. And woven into all of this, never quite separate from it, was the laundry. Now I want to be careful here, because the word laundry does not begin to convey what this actually involved. The process used in most Tudor households for washing heavy linen, the sheets, the tablecloths, the shirts and undergarments, was called bucking. And bucking was not something you did every week. It was an event. A major undertaking that might happen every few weeks, sometimes only a few times a year, for the heaviest items because of the sheer labour and resources it required. A large wooden tub, the buck tub, was set up on a stand with a tap near the bottom. The linen was folded inside it in specific layers, with sticks placed between the bundles to allow liquid to pass through. Then a caustic liquid made from wood ash soaked in water was poured repeatedly through the cloth, draining from the tap below, and then poured back through from the top again and again. The cloth was soaked, drained, soaked again, sometimes beaten with wooden paddles, sometimes heated, and before the lye to deal with the worst stains, urine, collected from chamber pots. The ammonia in the urine was genuinely effective at breaking down grease and biological matter. This was not ignorance. This was applied chemistry without the vocabulary of chemistry, and it worked. There are records noting with complete seriousness that men's urine was considered more effective than women's for laundry purposes, to which I can only say that whoever wrote that down was probably not the one doing the washing. After all of this, the linen was rinsed, draped over bushes or spread on grass to dry and bleach in whatever sunlight England chose to offer, then folded and returned to the house. The whole process could take the better part of a day done outdoors even in winter, because the water had to go somewhere, and there was no drainage inside the house. Clean white linen was in Tudor society a sign of respectability. The whiter the linen, the more wealth it implied, because only a household with enough labour and resources could maintain that standard. The effort required to keep linen white was so substantial that it functioned as a visible signal of social standing. What looked like a purely aesthetic choice was actually a declaration of economic capacity. Every laundry day was in this sense a small performance of the household's standing in the world. Here is a question I want to ask you directly. Think about what we have covered so far in just one woman's year: the garden, the medicine, the brewing, the spinning, the cloth production, the autumn preservation, the laundry. And I have not yet mentioned cooking 3 meals a day, or carrying water, or minding children, or attending neighbours' childbirths as an informal midwife, or keeping household accounts. Now tell me, does the word housewife feel adequate? I genuinely ask, because I think the problem is not with the work. The problem is with the word. The word suggests something bounded, domestic, contained. A housewife manages a house. But what the Tudor housewife actually managed was closer to a small enterprise, a food production business, a textile workshop, a medical practice, a brewery, and a school for the next generation, all running simultaneously from the same set of hands. The historian who first made me think about this properly pointed out that the reason Tudor men's work is so well documented is that it happened in public in guilds and markets and courts and churches. The reason Tudor women's work is so poorly documented is that it happened mostly at home among women passed down verbally, rather than in writing. It was not less real, it was not less skilled, it was simply not the kind of work that left paper trails. Winter was not rest. I think some part of us imagines the darker months as a natural pause, the household drawing inward the pace, slowing the cold, enforcing a kind of stillness. But for an ordinary Tudor woman, winter meant a different set of demands rather than fewer demands. The spinning moved indoors. The sewing and mending done by rushlight or the fire's glow went on as long as there was any light at all. Wool that had been sheared in summer was worked through the winter months, combed and carded and spun, building toward the cloth that would be needed in spring. Animals that were still living needed feeding and tending. Illness struck more often in the cold and damp, and the household medicine chest, such as it was kept close to hand, and threading through all of it subtly but persistently was the question of the next pregnancy. In a world without reliable contraception, the pregnancies came regularly. Not every woman's experience was the same, but it was not unusual for a Tudor woman to be pregnant 6, 7, 8 times across her reproductive years, and not unusual either for several of those pregnancies to end in loss either during gestation or in the terrifyingly dangerous weeks that followed birth. We will return to this in much more detail when we talk about children and childhood in this story. But for now, what matters is what pregnancy meant for the unbroken chain of daily work. A Tudor woman did not stop working when she was pregnant. The household did not pause. The ale still needed brewing, the linen still needed washing, the animals still needed feeding. She worked until she could not, and sometimes past that point. And when the birth came, she was attended by other women, her mother, her neighbours, a midwife if one was available in a world entirely closed to men. No physician, no male presence of any kind unless the situation became so dire that extraordinary measures were needed. Birth was the business of women, and it was conducted in a room sealed off from the rest of the house, candle-lit, herb-scented, governed entirely by female knowledge and female prayer. That knowledge was serious, hard-won, and often genuinely effective, and it operated in complete institutional invisibility, never trained in a university, never licensed by a guild, never recognized in any official record. I keep coming back to the word invisible. Not because I want to make this into a lament, though there is grief in it, I think, for anyone who sits with it long enough, but because invisibility is the specific thing that history did to these women, and it is worth naming clearly. The Venetian diplomat who visited England in 1513 and wrote about the rush-covered floors, he noticed the women going to market. He mentioned them in passing as background scenery. The legal system that governed Tudor England did not recognise a married woman as a separate legal entity from her husband. She could not own property in her own name. She could not enter into contracts. If she ran a business, its profits belonged to her husband. And yet she ran businesses. She kept the household alive. She made preserved, brewed, spun, healed and buried. She midwifed her neighbours' children into the world, and shepherded her own household sick back from the edge of it. There is something I find almost staggering about that combination. So much power and capability, so little official recognition of any of it. The woman I described at the beginning of this story, the one whose name we do not know, lived her whole life performing work that the people around her absolutely depended on, and she did it without any particular expectation of being seen for it. That was simply the world she was born into. She did not know another framework was possible. Neither really did anyone else. But we are here 500 years later trying to see it. And the least we can do is look carefully. What she fed her family from that garden, that kitchen, those salted barrels, those brewing vats, that is the next chapter of this story. Because what Tudor people actually ate across all the divisions of class and season and faith tells us something extraordinary about how they understood the world, their bodies, and their place in the order of things. And one of the most surprising revelations in the history of the Tudor diet is this. The people we might assume ate the worst were often in one very specific way the healthiest. Come find out why. There is a particular kind of historical irony that takes a moment to fully land. The kind where you realize that the people who had everything, the power, the wealth, the servants, the feasts, the choice, were in one very specific and measurable way doing considerably worse than the people who had almost nothing at all. Tudor England had one of those ironies, and it sat at every table every single day in what people chose to put in their mouths. Let us start at the bottom of the social ladder because that is where the surprise is. The ordinary working family in a Tudor village or market town ate a diet that if you described it to a modern nutritionist without mentioning the century, they would probably call reasonably balanced. Bread dense coarse made from rye or barley, or a mixture of grains with all the fibre still intact. Pottage, that thick simmering soup of grains, vegetables, legumes, and whatever herbs the garden offered that week. Cabbage, leeks, onions, parsnips, dried peas and beans, cheese and butter when the household kept cattle or goats, eggs, fish several days a week by law, fresh fruit in season, preserved fruit in winter. It was not glamorous. No one was rhapsodizing about their rye bread and pea pottage the way a nobleman might describe a roasted peacock presented at the table with its feathers reattached for visual effect. But it was by the nutritional standards we actually now understand a diet that served the body reasonably well. Plenty of fibre, regular vegetables and legumes, not too much concentrated fat or refined sugar. Seasonal variety built into the calendar by necessity. The poor did not choose this diet because they were wise. They chose it because it was what they could afford, and meat, especially the expensive red meats of beef and venison, was largely beyond their means except on feast days and special occasions. And that, as it turned out, was a blessing none of them knew they had. Now step up the ladder. Walk into the hall of a gentleman farmer, a prosperous merchant, a minor nobleman. The table changes dramatically. Meat. This is what wealth looked like at mealtimes, and the Tudor nobility wore their meat consumption the way later centuries would wear luxury fashion as proof conspicuous and deliberate that they could afford the best. Roasted beef, mutton, pork, venison, which was particularly prized and legally restricted to those who held the right to hunt it. Swan, heron, peacock, porpoise on special occasions, which tells you something about the Tudor willingness to eat virtually any creature that moved if it could be dressed elegantly enough. At the grandest feasts, estimates suggest the noble diet was approximately 80% protein, 80%. Plates of meat after meat after meat with bread mainly as a vehicle for consuming more of it, and vegetables appearing primarily as garnish or as the humble accompaniment that no self-respecting nobleman would boast about. The gout, that agonizing joint condition caused by the build-up of uric acid from a protein-heavy diet, was so prevalent among Tudor noblemen that it was practically considered an occupational hazard of wealth. Henry VIII himself suffered from it severely in his later years, along with leg ulcers, obesity, and what many modern historians believe were the combined health consequences of decades of exactly the diet his wealth made possible. The king, who had every resource in the kingdom at his disposal, managed to eat himself in part into a state of considerable physical misery, Meanwhile, down the road, the labourer eating his pea pottage and coarse bread had healthier arteries and better teeth. History is quietly hilarious sometimes. The teeth deserve their own moment because the story of Tudor teeth is one of those facts that sounds made up until you examine the evidence. For most of the Tudor period, particularly in the earlier decades when sugar was rare and expensive, the teeth of ordinary English people were, by archaeological evidence, not particularly bad. Rye bread and hard grain, chewed daily, actually functioned as a mild abrasive that kept teeth relatively clean. The absence of refined sugar from the diet meant the decay-causing bacteria had less to work with. Skulls from commoner burials of the early Tudor period show considerably better dental health than those from wealthy households of the same era. Then sugar arrived. Not all at once, but gradually, with increasing momentum through the 16th century. It came from the West and East Indies, from Morocco, from Barbary, carried on trading ships, refined, packed and sold, at prices that put it firmly in the luxury category. Only the rich could afford it, and the rich loved it completely lavishly, and without any awareness of what it was doing to them. Sugar sculptures appeared at noble banquets, entire centerpieces of castles' animals, and ships carved from hardened sugar paste admired and then eaten. Sugar-dusted fruits, marchpane, that early cousin of marzipan, sweetmeats of every description, and the toothpaste of choice sugar paste rubbed over the teeth and gums with a cloth in the sincere belief that sugar had cleansing properties. By the later part of Elizabeth I's reign, the consequences were unmistakable. Queen Elizabeth herself, and she is the most documented case, though far from the only one, had developed a powerful lifelong addiction to sweet things that her position made it impossible to resist. By her mid-60s, a German traveller named Paul Hentzner visited the English court and recorded his observations with the frank curiosity of a man writing home about a foreign country. He described Elizabeth as 65 years old, her face oblong and fair, but wrinkled her teeth in his words, black a defect the English seemed subject to from their too great use of sugar. She wore false teeth to fill the gaps. Her speech by late in her reign was reportedly difficult for visitors to understand, partly because of the state of her mouth. She continued to eat sweets regardless. But here is the part that makes this story genuinely extraordinary. Having black teeth from sugar became fashionable. Think about that for a moment. Because only the wealthy could afford enough sugar to rot their teeth. Black teeth became a status symbol. A visible marker of the kind of wealth that came with constant access to expensive sweetness. And the lower classes, who could not afford sugar at all, and therefore had perfectly decent teeth, responded by artificially blackening their teeth with soot to appear richer, to look as though they too had been destroying their mouths with imported luxury. Human beings will go to remarkable lengths to perform a status they do not actually possess. The Tudor version of faking luxury goods was burning your teeth black with soot to look like you could afford the sugar that would have done it naturally. I have thought about this more than once when watching people in the present day do very different but structurally identical things. Now let us talk about the law and the food calendar, because this is where the Tudor diet gets genuinely stranger. What you ate in Tudor England was not entirely your own business. The Church had always regulated fasting, the 40 days of Lent, Fridays and Saturdays, as days of abstinence from meat, the vigils of major feast days. These were religious obligations enforced by community expectation and ecclesiastical disapproval. For the devout, they were a form of discipline. For the pragmatic, they were a reason to eat fish. But after the Reformation broke the old religious framework, something interesting happened. Queen Elizabeth I, through her chief adviser William Cecil, passed an Act of Parliament in 1563 that made fish days a matter of secular law rather than religious practice. Wednesdays were added to Fridays and Saturdays as mandatory non-meat days. The stated reason was explicitly not spiritual. The Act itself declared in plain language that these restrictions existed for the better maintenance and increase of the navy, and not for any superstition. The logic was elegant in a thoroughly pragmatic way. England needed sailors. Sailors came from fishing communities. Fishing communities needed fish markets. Fish markets needed consistent demand. Consistent demand required people to eat fish by law several times a week. So when you sat down to your salted herring on a Wednesday in Tudor England, you were not just observing tradition or practicing faith. You were in a very direct sense subsidizing the Royal Navy. The penalty for eating meat on a restricted day was 3 months in prison or a fine of £3, a significant sum for most households. A London butcher who slaughtered 3 oxen during Lent in 1561 was fined £20. The rich could buy licenses to eat meat any day of the week, with the cost of the license calibrated to their social status. Because naturally, even the law around food was organised according to how much money you had. Let me tell you about beaver, and why it tells you so much about how Tudor people thought about food categories. Under the rules of fish days, fish was defined with a breadth that would make any modern zoologist weep. It included obviously cod and herring and salmon and eel, but it also included veal and poultry if they were somehow associated with water, and it included beaver. Beaver was classified as a fish. The reasoning, such as it was, ran like this: the beaver lived in water, and its tail was scaly. Ergo, it was a water creature. Ergo, it was fish. And therefore, if you wanted a piece of roasted meat on a Friday, and you had access to a beaver, canon law would not technically object to your dining. This is not a joke. This is documented practice. The same logic applied in parts of Catholic Europe to puffin seabirds that spent most of their time at sea, and to various other creatures that could be argued with a straight face to be sufficiently associated with water to escape the meat prohibition. What this tells us is something important about how Tudor people related to food rules. They were not passive recipients of regulation. They were active, creative, sometimes remarkably sophisticated negotiators with the systems that governed their lives. The question of what foods were considered safe, desirable, and appropriate also reveals how Tudor people understood the human body itself, and here the distance between their world and ours feels enormous. Tudor medical theory operated largely within the framework inherited from ancient Greek medicine, the doctrine of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each food had a character: hot or cold, wet or dry, and the art of eating well was the art of maintaining balance among these properties within your particular body. A naturally hot constitution needed cooling foods. A cold temperament required warming ones. Raw fruit was viewed with deep suspicion, not because of any notion of bacteria. Germ theory was 3 centuries away, but because fruit was cold and wet in humoral terms, and cold, wet things were believed to corrupt the stomach and generate illness. Recipes and household manuals of the period regularly warn against eating fruit without first cooking, preserving or at minimum spicing it to neutralize its dangerous qualities. This is why the Tudor diet preserved and cooked so much of the fruit that the garden produced. Not merely for storage, but because uncooked fruit was in the framework they had available a health risk. The paradox is that cooking and heavily spicing fruit does in fact reduce some of its nutritional value. Tudor medicine was protecting people from a danger that did not exist, while inadvertently reducing some of the benefit of the very food it was handling. Which is, I suppose, a reasonable summary of a great deal of pre-scientific medicine. Here is one more detail that I want you to hold. Every meal in a Tudor household came with bread, not as a side dish, as infrastructure. The trencher was a thick slice of stale bread, sometimes several days old, specifically left to harden, placed on the table as a combined plate and napkin and food absorber. Sauces, gravies, and potages were poured onto or served beside the trencher. By the end of the meal, the trencher had absorbed the juices of everything around it, becoming a saturated slab of flavoured, softened bread that was then either eaten by its owner, if the family had moderate means given to servants, if the household was more prosperous, or passed to the poor at the gate, if the family had pretensions to charity. The phrase on the trencher, meaning directly on the table of someone's household as a dependent, comes from this practice, and so does the word trencherman, meaning someone with a hearty appetite. Both words preserve in amber a material reality that vanished completely once ceramic and pewter plates became common. Language does that. It carries the fossils of the past around in our mouths and we never notice. Something worth pausing over because the Tudor table was also in its own particular way a theatre. The rules around who sat where, what they were served, how they were served, and in what vessel they ate from were not mere conventions. They were the working machinery of social hierarchy made visible 3 times a day. Pewter plates were for the middling sort. Wooden trenchers were for labourers and servants. Gold and silver plate actual vessels made of precious metal were for those at the very top. When Cardinal Wolsey hosted his famous dinners at Hampton Court, before his fall from grace guests ate from gold plate and were served by kneeling attendants. The food itself almost became secondary to the performance of power around it. Even the salt told the story. The great salt cellar sat at the centre of a table, and where you sat in relation to it determined your status in that room. Above the salt meant you were important. Below the salt meant you were not. This particular expression has outlasted its origin so completely that most people who use it today have no idea it was ever about an actual piece of furniture at an actual table. The Tudor meal, from the poorest pottage scraped from a single pot to the most elaborate royal feast, was always telling a story about the world that produced it. A story about who mattered, who did not, who was seen, and who was invisible. About what you could afford and what that affordability said about your place in the order of things. And running through all of it, quiet and persistent, was the religious calendar, those fish days, those feast days, those 40 days of Lent, that structured not just what you ate, but when and in doing so kept time for a society that had no other clock but the church bell and the turning seasons. We have been inside this house for a while now. We have followed its mornings, walked its rooms, stood beside its fire, traced the year through a woman's hands. We have eaten its bread and its pottage and its improbably classified beaver. But there is something about this house we have not yet properly entered, something darker than any room we have visited so far. It is the question of how the people who lived here took care of themselves when illness came, which in Tudor England it did with a frequency and a speed that would seem almost unimaginable to us now. How did they understand what was happening to their bodies? What did they reach for when the fever climbed? And what did those remedies, the genuine ones, the desperate ones, the ones that were essentially the medical equivalent of wishful thinking, tell us about the line between knowledge and fear? That is where we are headed. And some of what you're about to hear is going to be deeply strange. Some of it is going to be genuinely impressive, and 1 or 2 things will make you wonder how anyone survived at all. Right, let us clear something up. Because there is a version of Tudor England that lives in the popular imagination, people who never bathed, who smelled unspeakable, who lurched through their days beneath layers of grime, while illness circulated freely around them, and that version is mostly wrong. Not entirely wrong, but mostly. The truth is considerably stranger, considerably more interesting, and in 1 or 2 places genuinely impressive. Let us start with what Tudor people actually believed about cleanliness, because their logic, and it was logic just operating on premises we no longer hold, tells you something important about how they saw the world. In the middle of the 16th century, a physician named Thomas Moulton wrote a medical guide called The Mirror or Glass of Health. It was a practical book widely read, the kind of household reference that educated families kept alongside their Bible. and in it Moulton was very clear about bathing. Do not do it. Or more precisely, do not do it in hot water, because hot water, Moulton explained, opened the pores of the skin, and open pores were an invitation for miasmas to enter the body. Miasmas, those invisible poisonous vapours believed to drift through stagnant air, to rise from marshes and muck heaps, to carry plague and sweating sickness from person to person, were the reigning explanation for infectious disease in an age before germ theory. And they were thought to enter the body in two ways, through the mouth and nose and through the skin, if the pores were left unguarded. So the recommended Tudor hygiene routine was not laziness. It was a deliberate medical strategy. Keep the pores sealed, cover the body thoroughly, change the linen layer next to the skin frequently, because linen was believed to draw impurities out of the body through contact, and clean linen meant clean skin by the logic of the day. This last belief, it turns out, was not entirely wrong. The historian and living history practitioner Ruth Goodman spent 3 months following this exact routine. No baths, no showers, but clean linen changed daily, and a nightly rub down with a dry linen cloth. She lived in modern society throughout this experiment, surrounded by people who had no idea what she was doing. Nobody noticed. Nobody commented on any smell. Her skin, she reported, was in better condition than usual. The linen constantly washed was doing exactly what Tudor medicine believed it did, absorbing sweat and keeping the surface of the body reasonably fresh. A colleague of hers tried the inverse, full modern bathing daily, but the same outer clothes worn for months without washing. The smell, he reported, was overwhelming within weeks. The conclusion sits somewhere unexpected in the Tudor system. What mattered was not washing the body with water, but keeping the cloth next to the body clean. And keeping cloth clean was exactly what Tudor households, as we saw earlier in this story, spent an enormous amount of time and labour doing. The two systems are not actually so different in outcome. They are just different in method. That said, the Tudors absolutely did wash. Let us be clear about that too. Hands and face were washed daily. This was basic courtesy expected of everyone regardless of class. Etiquette books of the period spend considerable time on the proper washing of hands before meals, after meals, and before handling anything belonging to another person. The courtier who approached the Queen without freshly washed hands was the Tudor equivalent of someone who turns up to a business meeting with stained clothes, technically functional, deeply communicating the wrong message. The wealthy bathed more fully and more often than the poor, simply because they had the resources to heat enough water and the servants to carry it. Henry VIII had personal bathrooms with functional plumbing installed at Hampton Court, Windsor, and Whitehall, actual running water, hot and cold, which was extraordinary for any domestic building of that era. The bath water was perfumed with herbs, cinnamon, mint, licorice, rose petals. He seems to have been genuinely devoted to this practice, driven partly by vanity and partly by his well-documented terror of illness. Elizabeth I is the complicated case. She's famous for the remark that she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, a line that has been quoted endlessly as evidence of Tudor filth. But the fuller picture is more nuanced. Elizabeth had elaborate private bathing facilities at her palaces, including a dedicated steam room. She travelled with a portable hip bath. Late in her reign, when she'd become very old and ill, and was retreating from the world, she refused to be bathed or examined by physicians. But that tells us more about her mental state at the end of a long and stressful life than about any general attitude toward hygiene. The real answer is probably this. Elizabeth was a woman who cared a great deal about personal cleanliness, who found elaborate bathing somewhat burdensome, and whose famous remark has been stripped of all its context and turned into a caricature. Sound familiar? History does this to women rather a lot, but the most vivid, the most viscerally real piece of this story, the one that keeps me coming back to it, is not soap or bathing habits, it is the disease. Specifically, it is sweating sickness. Because if you want to understand what it meant to live in a Tudor body in a Tudor household with Tudor medicine standing between you and whatever was circulating through the air of that century, you need to understand the sweat. The sweating sickness appeared in England in September 1485, less than 3 weeks after Henry Tudor's army arrived in London following their victory at Bosworth Field. It came from nowhere. Nobody had seen it before. It had no equivalent in any medical text the physicians could consult. What it did was this. It killed with breathtaking speed in a sequence that the physician John Caius documented in detail after the final outbreak in 1551. First came a sense of dread, a sudden, inexplicable feeling of impending doom like a shadow falling across the room. Then violent shivering, sometimes severe enough to crack ribs. Then headache, aching joints, overwhelming exhaustion. This was the cold stage, and it lasted perhaps 3 hours. Then came the sweating. The body became furnace hot. The heart raced dangerously. Thirst beyond anything the patient had experienced. Chest pain, palpitations, a desperate urge to sleep. And with that urge to sleep came the warning that the physicians issue to anyone with a patient in the sweating stage: do not let them sleep. To fall asleep during the sweating phase was to risk never waking up. Caregivers were told to keep the patient awake to talk to them, to physically prevent them from surrendering to what must have been an almost irresistible pull toward unconsciousness. Death, when it came within 24 hours of the first symptoms. The phrase that attached itself to the disease in contemporary accounts was devastating in its simplicity. Merry at dinner, dead by supper. The 1485 outbreak killed 15,000 Londoners within 6 weeks, out of an estimated population of 50,000. 15,000 in 6 weeks in a single city. Henry VII was so terrified that he postponed his own coronation. The disease struck, retreated, and returned in major waves in 1507, 15, 17, 15, 28, and 1551. The 1528 outbreak was particularly devastating. It spread beyond England into Germany and across mainland Europe, burning through Hamburg, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden. It killed cardinals, it killed courtiers, it killed the young and healthy at a rate that bewildered everyone who observed it. One of the strangest features of the sweat was that it seemed to prefer the wealthy. The physician John Caius noted that the patients most at risk were men of wealth, ease, or welfare. The poor, the people living in drafty cottages doing physical labour, eating coarse food, survived at higher rates than the rich men feasting in comfortable halls. Nobody in the 16th century could explain why. Modern researchers still debate it. Anne Boleyn contracted the disease in the 1528 outbreak and survived. Her brother-in-law William Carey did not. Thomas Cromwell's wife Elizabeth died in the same outbreak along with their 2 daughters. Henry VIII, who was by all accounts genuinely terrified of illness, responded to the epidemic by sleeping in a different bed every night, dispersing the court and sending letter after anxious letter to Anne Boleyn as she recovered. After 1551, sweating sickness disappeared completely. It has never returned. Scientists and historians still do not know with certainty what it was. Let me ask you something. We know what the Black Death was: the plague Yersinia pestis carried by fleas on rats. We know what smallpox was. We know what typhus was. Modern microbiology has given names and mechanisms to almost every historical epidemic, but sweating sickness, this disease that appeared in 1485 and killed thousands, spread across an entire continent, and then vanished in 1551 as completely as it had arrived, remains genuinely unidentified. The leading current hypothesis is that it may have been a form of hantavirus carried by rodents, but nobody knows for certain. There is something about that specific gap in our knowledge, one plague among dozens that we simply cannot account for, that I find quietly extraordinary. 500 years of inquiry and the sweat is still a mystery. The people who lived through it had even less to work with. They faced it with Herb's prayer and the injunction not to fall asleep. For ordinary illnesses, fevers, infections, wounds, the persistent aches and swellings of a physically hard life. The Tudor household relied first on its own resources, and only then reluctantly and expensively on a physician. The licensed physician trained at Oxford or Cambridge in the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates was an urban luxury for the wealthy. His consultation fee was beyond the means of most working families, and his methods were, from our perspective, mixed in their usefulness. Uroscopy was the primary diagnostic tool. The physician would examine a sample of the patient's urine, assessing its colour, its clarity, its smell, and sometimes its taste to determine what imbalance of humours was producing the symptoms. A flask of urine told a Tudor physician roughly what a battery of blood tests tells a modern one. The theory was wrong, but the observation was careful, and experienced physicians developed a genuine empirically grounded instinct for what certain presentations of urine signalled about the patient's condition. Bloodletting was performed to relieve fevers on the theory that excess blood was the cause of the heat. Astrology played a role. Different zodiacal signs were believed to govern different parts of the body, and the timing of treatment was calibrated accordingly. And yet, alongside all of this, the household's own medicine, the remedies compounded from the herb garden, the preparations made from beeswax and vinegar, and the plants that had been grown and studied for generations included things that genuinely worked. Willow bark for pain and fever contains salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. Honey on wounds is antimicrobial. Elderberries have real immune-supporting properties. The women who kept household remedy books, who compiled their preparations, carefully tested them, corrected them, and passed them to their daughters, were practicing something that looked like science because it was. Empirical, cumulative, rigorously evaluated against results. The famous English philosophers Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes both reportedly preferred female healers to licensed male physicians when they themselves were ill, which says something rather pointed about whose knowledge they actually trusted in a moment of vulnerability. There is one detail about Tudor hygiene that I have saved for last because it is the kind of thing that sounds like it should not be true, and then turns out to be exactly, precisely, documentary evidence true. The pomander. A pomander was a small decorative ball, often made of gold or silver, often beautifully crafted, filled with a mixture of aromatic spices, herbs and resins. Ambergris musk, cloves, cinnamon, rose. You held it or hung it from a belt or girdle, or pressed it against your nose when passing through areas believed to carry bad air. The pomander was in the framework of miasma theory a personal air filter, a portable attempt to keep the bad smells and therefore the disease they were thought to carry from reaching the wearer's body. And here is the thing, they were not completely wrong. Not about miasmas, which do not exist. But the aromatic compounds in clove, cinnamon and certain resins do have genuine antimicrobial properties. The pomander was not doing what its owner thought it was doing, but it was doing something. Tudor medicine was not pure superstition. It was a system of observation built on incorrect fundamental premises, producing a mix of genuinely effective remedies and completely useless ones, with no reliable way to distinguish between them. Which means that when it got something right, it got it right by accident rather than by understanding. And when it got something wrong, as with the sweating sickness, as with the plague, the wrong was catastrophic. The people who lived through the Tudor century knew this in their bones in a way we have largely forgotten. Every morning you woke up was a morning you had survived another night. Every meal you shared with the full household was a meal everyone had made it to. Every summer brought the possibility of the sweat. Every autumn brought the possibility of something else. They did not live in fear, that is not quite the right word. They lived in awareness, a dense present tense awareness of the body's fragility that we protected by antibiotics and clean water and germ theory do not carry the same way. I wonder sometimes whether that awareness, uncomfortable as it was frightening, as it was also gave them something we have quietly lost, a sharpness of attention to the present moment that comes only when the present moment is genuinely not guaranteed. All of this, the medicine, the disease, the hygiene, the proximity to serious illness, shape something fundamental about how this household thought about the most vulnerable members within it, its children. Because childhood in Tudor England was not the protected, extended, gradually released into adulthood experience we've constructed over the last century or so. It was something harder, stranger, and in its own way much more honest about what life actually required. What did childhood look like inside these walls? When did it begin, and when very abruptly did it end? And what can those small, overlooked lives tell us about what this household truly valued? That is the room we are stepping into next. And the first thing that happens when a Tudor child enters the world will catch you completely off guard. The first thing that happened when a Tudor child entered the world was not a name. It was not a blanket, not a nursery, not a rattle hanging above a crib. Before any of those things, before the household had barely drawn breath, the baby was carried to the church to be baptized, not the next day, not that week, hours after birth, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes before the mother had even properly recovered from the delivery. The newborn wrapped tight in linen was carried through whatever weather England had arranged that particular day, rain, frost, summer, heat, it made no difference, and presented to the priest at the font. The reason was not custom, it was terror. If a child died without baptism, it could not enter heaven. That was the teaching. That was the absolute, unambiguous, terrifying teaching of the church in which these people lived, and through which they understood everything about existence, including what happened after death. An unbaptized baby occupied a theological grey zone, not condemned to hell exactly, but excluded from paradise, suspended in a limbo that offered no comfort whatsoever to a grieving mother who had just lost a child. So baptism happened fast. The midwives themselves were trained to perform emergency baptism if a baby seemed likely to die before the priest arrived. That single detail a midwife authorized to perform a sacrament that was otherwise the exclusive province of ordained clergy tells you everything about the urgency with which this was treated. It was not theology made flexible, it was theology responding to mortality. The numbers behind all of this are hard to sit with even now. Around 17% of Tudor babies died before their first birthday. Around 30% of children born did not survive to age 15. In a household with 6 children, which was not unusual, and in many households far short of the actual total, the statistical expectation was that at least 1, probably 2, would not live to see adulthood. And yet, this is the part that the old popular history got entirely wrong. For decades, influenced by a 1960s thesis by the French social historian Philippe Ariès, scholars argued that because infant mortality was so high, Tudor parents did not form strong emotional attachments to their young children. That they held themselves at a psychological distance, kept their hearts guarded, treated very small children almost as objects whose survival was uncertain, rather than as people worth grieving. That you did not invest love you could not afford to lose. More recent scholarship has dismantled this idea almost completely. We have the letters, we have the school exercises, we have the memorial brasses, we have the family mausoleums where small stone figures of dead children are carved in loving detail, placed alongside their parents preserved in stone so they would not be forgotten. Among wealthy families, children's birthdays were recorded in family books, not just the date, but the time of day the gifts received the names of those present. A translation exercise given to schoolboys in the late 15th century contains the phrase, "A great while after my brother died, my mother was wont to sit weeping every day." This is not the behaviour of people who are emotionally detached from their children. This is a mother sitting weeping every day described so specifically and with such evident familiarity that the teacher chose to use it as an example sentence. Tudor parents loved their children. They grieved them when they died. The high mortality rate did not build walls around their hearts. It made the love more desperate, more immediate, more urgent, in the way that all things we know we might lose become more precious for the knowing. But let's go back to the beginning. To the baby itself, fresh and swaddled and probably not entirely happy about any of this. Swaddling, the practice of wrapping a newborn tightly in strips of linen from shoulders to feet, so that arms and legs could not move, looks from our vantage point like something between a straitjacket and a bandage. Modern paediatric practice strongly discourages anything resembling it, and yet it was universal in Tudor England across every social class, and it was not done carelessly or without reasoning. The logic was this newborns had soft, unformed limbs. Without firm support, those limbs might grow crooked, bent, deformed. The swaddling was in the Tudor understanding a kind of scaffolding holding the body's architecture in the correct alignment, while the bones hardened. Babies were kept swaddled for the first 8 to 12 months, sometimes longer. Here is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about swaddling, though. The Tudor home, as we've walked through together, was genuinely dangerous for a mobile infant. Open fires, iron pots of boiling liquid, uneven earth floors, dogs, tools, steps without railings. A swaddled baby in a wooden cradle was in very practical terms a safer baby than one crawling freely around a space where every surface could potentially cause serious harm. The court records of the period are full of grim entries about unswaddled or unsupervised toddlers who had fallen into fires or out of windows. It was not an entirely irrational system. It just looks that way to eyes that have never had to design a childcare solution around an open hearth and no safety gates. If the baby survived and every single time that threshold was crossed, it was a genuine relief the next phase of life began. For the first year or two, the picture is relatively recognizable. A child was nursed, rocked, sung to. The songs they sang are not entirely lost to us. Historians have traced some of the nursery rhymes we still know today back to the Tudor period. 3 Blind Mice. Yes, that one appears in musical manuscripts from the 1600s in forms that clearly predate that recording. Jack Boy Ho Boy was a well-documented children's song. The games that older children played, blind man's bluff, leapfrog, stoolball variations of what we might call tag or hide and seek, were so standard that contemporary writers mentioned them casually, the way you would mention something too obvious to require explanation. Thomas More, writing in the 1490s, put a speech in the mouth of a personified childhood. "I am called childhood in play, is all my mind." That expectation that play was part of what childhood meant was genuine and recognized, not just a modern projection backward, and the toys they played with had a sweetness to them that cuts across 5 centuries quite cleanly. Dolls made from cloth or wood, miniature sets of household objects, tiny pewter pots, miniature versions of the tools adults used that let children imitate the world they were watching, whistles, hobby horses, bulls made from inflated pig bladders stitched tight and dried which poorer children would have made themselves, marbles of baked clay, carved wooden animals. None of this is unrecognizable. None of it feels foreign. A child with a carved wooden horse and a cloth doll is not so very different from a child with a plastic horse and a fabric doll. The scale is different. The material is different. The instinct is exactly the same. But childhood did not last long. Around age 5 or 6, a child of any family with the means to use them would begin formal education or at minimum structured religious instruction. The day started early. School hours were long, and the curriculum was narrow: Latin religious texts, arithmetic. The instrument of correction was a birch switch applied without apology on the understanding that children needed discipline as plants need pruning, and that the discomfort of correction was simply part of learning to be a person. Corporal punishment in Tudor schools was not sadism. It was a pedagogical theory, a genuinely held belief that the body and the mind were connected, and that physical correction could reshape both simultaneously. We look back at it with discomfort, and that discomfort is justified. But it helps to understand it as a system with internal logic rather than as random cruelty. The boys of the prosperous merchant and gentry classes attended grammar schools. Grammar, meaning Latin grammar, the foundation of every educated profession. The sons of the very wealthy had private tutors at home. The sons of the poor, if they attended any formal schooling at all, received it through the church, and many did not attend at all. Daughters, as ever, were educated mainly at home by their mothers, if they were educated at all, with the content depending entirely on the mother's own learning and the family's ambitions for their daughter's future. One small detail I find remarkable: even the poorest children who entered any kind of schooling learned to read with the same device, a hornbook. A flat piece of wood shaped like a paddle, with a sheet of paper printed with the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer attached to it, protected by a thin, transparent layer of flattened animal horn. It was a reading tablet, essentially. Functional, durable, and available at a price that put basic literacy within reach of households that could not afford actual books. The horn that protected the paper gives the object its name, and it gave generations of children their first encounter with the written word. Then comes the moment that every time I return to it feels like the sharpest departure from everything we now expect. Around age 7, sometimes a little older, sometimes a little younger, depending on family and circumstance, the child left. Not in the sense of growing up and moving on, in the literal sense of being sent to live in someone else's house. This was the custom. An assistant to the Venetian ambassador visiting England around 1500 wrote home about it with barely concealed bafflement. He observed that the English kept their children at home until the age of 7 or 9 at the utmost, and then put them out, both males and females, to hard service in the houses of other people, binding them generally for another 7 or 9 years. When he asked why, the English explained that it was for the children's own good. They would learn more in another household than they could at home. The diplomat wrote with some dry scepticism that he suspected the English simply preferred having other people's children in the household because they could feed them less and work them harder than their own. This is probably unfair as a complete explanation, and also probably not entirely wrong. The custom served real purposes. A child placed in a household of higher status than their own learned things, social skills, professional skills, manners, a broader world that their parents could not teach them at home. Noble boys went to other noble households to learn the arts of governance and warfare. Girls went to learn household management and courtly behaviour. Craftsmen's children went to serve as apprentices, learning the skills that would define their adult lives. Anne Boleyn famously was sent to the Netherlands and then to the French court as a young teenager, where she received an education that few English women of any generation have equalled. But the school exercises of the period preserve something about this custom that no official record would bother to mention. A child's letter written as a translation exercise survives the kind of practice text a teacher would give students to convert into Latin. It reads, "For all that was to me a pleasure when I was a child from 3 years old to 10, while I was under my father and mother's keeping, be turned now to torments and pain." That is a child, or the echo of a child, or the memory of a child, writing about what it felt like to leave home, the pleasure of the years before, the torments and pain of what came after. History does not usually preserve that kind of granular personal distress. The fact that this one survived embedded in a school exercise copied out by boys who perhaps felt something of the same thing seems almost unbearably poignant. Here is a question I have been sitting with, and I genuinely want to know what you think. We extend childhood much longer now. We protect it more deliberately. We furnish it with more resources. We argue rightly. I believe that children need time to develop before the full weight of adult responsibility is placed on them. All of this seems obviously correct by our standards. But what did the Tudor system give children that ours does not? Early meaningful participation in the work of the household, the experience of being genuinely useful from a young age, being embedded in a web of adult relationships rather than segregated into an age-specific world of school and peers. A sense that their presence mattered, that what they did made a real difference to the people around them. I'm not arguing for Tudor childhood. Nobody should be sent to hard service at 7 years old, and anyone who romanticizes that aspect of history is not thinking carefully enough about the child writing that exercise, about torments and pain. But the contrast is real, and it asks something of us. There is one more layer to Tudor childhood that we cannot skip because it shaped everything else about it in ways that are easy to overlook. The religious dimension was not separate from childhood. It was its entire architecture, from baptism to confirmation to the daily rhythms of prayer, from the saints' days that mark the calendar to the prayer said over a sick child. Faith was not a department of life that you visited on Sundays. It was the operating system. It was the thing through which a child learned to understand why they were here, what their obligations were, and what would happen to them after they died. The Reformation, that seismic decades-long upheaval, in the very foundation of religious life in England, driven forward by Henry VIII, and then Edward, and then Mary, and then Elizabeth, did not just change theology. It changed how children grieved. The doctrine of purgatory, which had allowed surviving family members to actively intercede for their dead through prayer and masses and candles, was abolished under the Protestant settlement. If your baby died, you could no longer light a candle for their soul. You could no longer pay for masses to ease their journey. The relationship between the living and the dead, which had been intimate and active and ongoing, was severed almost entirely. For parents who had grown up with the old framework, this was not a theological abstraction. It was a loss on top of a loss. The baby was gone, and now the means of maintaining connection with the baby, of doing something for them, was gone too. The pilgrimage of grace, the prayer book, rebellion, the many popular uprisings against religious change across the 16th century. These were not simply political or theological protests. They were in part the grief of people who'd been told that everything they had ever done for their dead was now theologically invalid. The candles they had burned, the masses they had paid for, the prayers said over small stones carved with the faces of children who did not survive, all of it suddenly officially done wrong. Tudor childhood was hard, it was short. It ended in work and responsibility, and often in physical separation from everyone who had known you when you were small. And it was also genuinely evidently in the letters, and the memorial brasses, and the weeping mothers, and the carved stone faces of children in family tombs deeply loved. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the tension between them is not something that resolves neatly. It just sits there uncomfortable and human. The children who survived all of this grew up. They entered the worlds of marriage and labour and faith and sex and power that adults have always navigated. And the bedroom, that space we have touched on only briefly so far in this story, contained more secrets about how Tudor adults actually lived than any other room in the house. The rules around it, the theology around it, the sleeping arrangements that would make most of us extremely uncomfortable, The strange, bifurcated night they kept waking in the middle of darkness and calling it perfectly normal. There is a great deal to say about what happened behind those curtained bed hangings, and some of it is going to genuinely surprise you. Of all the rooms in this house, the bedroom is the one that holds the most surprises. Not because of what happened there, though, some of that is genuinely startling, but because of what it meant, what it was for, how it functioned as a space, as a social institution, as a container, for a whole set of assumptions about life and love and the human body that are so different from our own, that stepping into a Tudor bedroom feels a little like stepping into a foreign country. Let us start with the bed itself, because the bed is where everything begins, and what Tudor people believed about beds, about who slept in them, how they slept, and what a bed said about the family who owned it, is the first of several things in this room that will catch you completely off guard. A good bed in Tudor England was not furniture, it was wealth. A wealthy gentleman named Thomas Offley had a detailed inventory made of his bedroom in 1582. The entry for his bed lists a plain bedstead with a wool mattress, a feather bed, and bolster white and red blankets, a green coverlet embroidered with letters and flowers, and a canopy and curtains of yellow and blue dyed canvas. The whole ensemble with its draped hangings and layered mattresses would have cost roughly £5. For context, a typical schoolmaster earned around £10 per year. The bed was worth half his annual salary. Shakespeare, and I mention him because the story is simply too perfect to leave out famously, left his wife Anne Hathaway his second best bed in his will. For 300 years this was interpreted as a cold snub evidence of a loveless marriage and a spiteful final insult. Scholars argued about it endlessly, but the reality is far more interesting than the insult. In a Tudor household, the best bed was kept in the most prominent ground floor room, often the parlour where it could be seen by anyone who entered. Not because anyone slept in it regularly, they did not, but because it was displayed, shown off. The most impressive piece of furniture in the house, positioned like a painting or a status symbol, precisely because it was enormously expensive and you wanted your visitors to know it. Distinguished guests were occasionally permitted to sleep in the best bed. The family almost certainly did not. The second best bed was the marital bed, the actual bed where husband and wife slept, where children were conceived and born, where the private life of the household happened. Leaving it to Anne was not an insult. It was Shakespeare leaving her the bed that had held their marriage, their history together, their most intimate shared object. It is one of those reversals that makes you realize how completely we project our own assumptions backward onto a world that organized things differently. Now let us talk about who else was in that bedroom. The answer will surprise most people. Everyone. Not metaphorically. Literally. Children slept in the same room as their parents, often in truckle beds, low-wheeled beds that could be rolled out from under the main bed at night and pushed back underneath during the day. Servants slept in the room as well, in the truckle or on the floor. In households without separate sleeping quarters, guests might join the arrangement too. The very poorest families in a single-room dwelling had everyone, adults, children, livestock in winter, sharing the same space without even the distinction of separate rooms to mark different functions. There is a story recorded by the historian Thomas Aubrey about the moment when William Roper came to propose marriage to one of Thomas More's daughters. He had declared his intention, but could not quite decide which daughter he preferred. Thomas More marched him upstairs to where both his teenage daughters were sleeping in the truckle bed right beside the parental bed, and pulled the blankets off both girls so William could appraise them. I want to sit with that story for a moment because it is uncomfortable in multiple directions at once. There is the obvious discomfort of daughters being shown off like goods at a market. That is real, and we should not gloss over it. But there is also the almost architectural strangeness of the scene, two young women of marriageable age sleeping in the same room as their parents as an entirely ordinary arrangement that nobody in the household found unusual in the slightest. This was not poverty. Thomas More was a prominent lawyer and later Lord Chancellor. This was simply how Tudor bedrooms worked. Privacy, as we have already established in this story, was not the organising principle of Tudor domestic life. The bedroom was not a private sanctuary. It was a shared space that happened to have beds in it. The sleeping itself was different from what we know. We have touched on this already, but the bedroom is where it becomes most vivid, so let us go deeper. The historian Roger Kirch spent years in the early 1990s tracking down historical references to sleep patterns, combing through court documents, medical texts, household diaries and literature. What he found buried in plain sight across centuries of European writing was a consistent description of sleep in two distinct phases, first sleep and second sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between. The first sleep began shortly after dark, perhaps at 8 or 9 in the evening. The household went to bed early because the darkness was real and sustained, and there was little point in burning expensive candles to stay awake once the day's work was done. People slept for several hours. Then somewhere around midnight they woke naturally roused. Many historians believe by the body's own rhythms, operating without the interference of artificial light, and spent an hour or two in this interstitial state. What did they do with those midnight hours? Some prayed. Some read if they had the luxury of literacy and moonlight strong enough to see by. There are records of people reading by the light of a full moon during this quiet interval. Some tended the fire, some talked quietly with whoever was awake beside them. A physician writing in the mid-16th century, Andrew Boord, recommended this wakeful period as the optimal time for intimacy between spouses, the body warm and relaxed, the mind calm, the distractions of the day finally silent. And then they went back to sleep. A second sleep, lighter and shorter, lasting until dawn, pulled the household back into its daily rhythms. This practice by phasic sleep, as researchers now call it, was not unusual. It was the norm across Europe before industrialization changed the nature of artificial light and synchronized human schedules to the demands of the factory clock. The people who study sleep deprivation today note that when human subjects are placed in darkness for extended periods, without artificial light, many naturally revert to this two-phase pattern. It appears to be something close to the body's genuine preference, suppressed for the last 2 centuries by the relentlessness of electric light and regulated work hours. I find this fascinating, not just as a historical curiosity, but because of what it implies about our own lives. The chronic sleep anxiety that many modern people experience, the 3 a.m. wakefulness that feels like a malfunction, like the body betraying us when we need rest, most urgently may not be a malfunction at all. It may be the old pattern surfacing through centuries of suppression, looking for the second sleep that never comes, because we have convinced ourselves that anything less than 8 unbroken hours is a problem to be solved. And then there is the theology of the bedroom. The church had opinions about what happened in beds, and it had a great many of them, and they were remarkably specific. Officially, marital intimacy existed for one purpose: reproduction. Pleasure for its own sake was theologically suspect, and a husband who pursued pleasure too enthusiastically was considered to be, as one period theologian put it, treating his wife as he might treat a woman he had paid. The language of that judgment tells you a great deal about how the church thought about women at the same time as it tried to regulate marriages, but alongside that restrictive framework ran something considerably more interesting. The belief drawn from the classical medical theory of Galen that conception required both partners to experience pleasure. The reasoning was that the female body, like the male body, produced a seed, and without the woman's satisfaction no seed would be produced and therefore no child conceived. This was medically incorrect, but it was genuinely held, and it had a remarkable practical consequence. A husband who wanted children had a medical and theological reason to ensure his wife's satisfaction during intimacy. The Reformed Church after the Reformation was in some ways even more direct about this. Post-Reformation Protestant theology emphasized conjugal love as the foundation of a good marriage, and theologians were remarkably frank by any era's standards about the mutual obligations of spouses to one another. Refusing the other was not just unkind, it was a spiritual failure. In short, Tudor bedroom theology was complicated. Restrictive in some directions, surprisingly explicit in others, and tangled in medical theory that shaped expectations in ways that cut both ways. The restrictions themselves deserve a moment because they are genuinely remarkable in their ambition. The Church prohibited marital intimacy during Lent, Advent, Easter week, all feast days of the Church calendar, all fast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, during the woman's menstrual cycle, during pregnancy, for 40 days after childbirth, during breastfeeding. Someone has actually done the mathematics on this. Taking all the restrictions together, the permissible days in a year amounted to somewhere around 100, out of 365. If this was rigidly followed, and most historians think it was followed selectively at best by most people at most times, it would render the Tudor birth rate almost impossible to explain. The historical evidence suggests with considerable tactfulness that most ordinary couples treated these rules the way most ordinary people have always treated inconvenient regulations, with intermittent awareness and strategic flexibility. Syphilis, for its part, provided a far more persuasive deterrent to intimacy outside of marriage than any theological ruling. The disease had appeared in Italy in 1495, reached England by 1503, and spread through the 16th century as a vivid, visible, undeniable consequence of extramarital activity. It was called the French pox in England, though the French preferred to call it the Italian disease. The Italians preferred to call it the French disease, and the matter of its national origin has apparently never been satisfactorily resolved. The bed as inheritance, the bed as social declaration, the bed as the site of theology, medicine, mortality, and the most intimate dimensions of ordinary human life. There is one more thing the Tudor bedroom tells us, and it is perhaps the strangest of all. The bed was public, not the activity in it, but the bed itself as object, as symbol, as statement. The tradition of the wedding night bedding ceremony, in which guests accompanied the bride and groom to the marriage chamber, helped the bride into the bed, and then withdrew with ribald toasts, and sometimes the throwing of a stocking was not an invasion of privacy. It was a ritual acknowledgement that the marriage was being consummated, that the couple was fulfilling their marital duty, that everything was proceeding correctly. It served a legal function as much as a social one. Witnesses to the bedding could, if required, testify that a marriage had been properly consummated, which mattered enormously in a world where an unconsummated marriage could be annulled. The bed, in other words, was never entirely yours. It was a site of personal intimacy conducted in a framework of social accountability that would feel claustrophobic to almost every modern person I can think of. And yet when I read the histories of Tudor marriages, the letters, the wills, the small pieces of evidence that survive, what I find more often than I expect is tenderness. People who chose their second best beds carefully, who left them to the people they had shared them with, who woke in the middle of the night and talked or read by moonlight, or simply lay in the darkness with another human being and breathed the same air for a few quiet hours before the day began again. The bed was never private, but it was intimate, and sometimes in ways the documents only partially capture it was deeply loved. Ask yourself something quiet. When was the last time you lay awake at 3 a.m. and felt like a failure for not being asleep? The Tudors would have simply put another log on the fire. This household has one more room we've not yet properly entered, one that governs everything else: the prayers, the calendar, the food, rules, the fear, the hope, the entire architecture of meaning within which these people understood their lives. The question of faith. Not the official political dynastic faith of Henry and his wives and their successors, but the private daily lived faith of ordinary people in ordinary households, navigating a century in which the very foundation of what they believed kept shifting under their feet. What did it actually feel like to live through the Reformation from inside a house like this one? Not in the court, not in Parliament, but here, in this kitchen, this bedroom, this life. That is a story worth telling carefully, and we are almost there. Before we enter this room, I want you to understand something that is almost impossible to fully grasp from where we stand. For the family we've been following through this house, the woman at the fire, the children being sent away, the husband coming home before the light fails, God was not a concept they held in a particular compartment of their lives. Not a Sunday appointment, not a philosophical position, not something they could set aside when it became inconvenient. God was the furniture. God was the architecture. God was the reason the day had the shape it had, the reason certain foods appeared on certain days, the reason a baby was carried to the church font within hours of birth. God was the reason the year had a rhythm that had nothing to do with the seasons and everything to do with the church calendar, its feasts and fasts, its commemorations and its silences, its 40 days of Lent and its 12 days of Christmas, and its holy days scattered through every month like nodes of obligation. And then in the 1530s the king decided to break with Rome. And for the ordinary people sitting in that house who had not been consulted, who had no vote, who had simply grown up knowing that the world worked a certain way, everything began to move. Let us start before the Reformation. Because to understand what changed you, first have to understand what was there. The historian Eamon Duffy spent years reconstructing the religious life of ordinary English parishes before Henry VIII made his break with the papacy, drawing largely on the material culture that survived wills accounts, inventories the physical evidence left in old churches. What he found was not the corrupt, sclerotic institution of Protestant propaganda, nor the universal spiritual vacuum that some historians had implied. What he found was a vibrant, communal, deeply participatory religious life embedded in every aspect of daily existence. On Palm Sunday there was a procession around the churchyard. The church bells rang, the choir sang, and flowers and holy bread were strewn over the choir boys as the procession returned to the porch. On Maundy Thursday, candles were set in a frame before the Easter sepulchre. On Corpus Christi there were processions around the village green. In Rogation Week, those 3 days before Ascension Thursday, the community walked the boundaries of the parish together, praying for rain or fair weather, as the season required reaffirming in body as well as word their relationship to the specific piece of land they inhabited. These were not merely religious performances. They were the social occasions of the year for communities that did not have newspapers or telephones or public gatherings of any other organized kind. The feast day was also the fair day, the day of games and beer and reunion. The Sunday service was the week's main piece of collective life. The church was the only building in the village large enough to hold everyone, and it held everything: the weddings, the funerals, the baptisms, the arguments about parish boundaries, the meetings of the manor court. The sacred and the civic were not separate spheres in Tudor England. They were the same sphere using the same room. The church bells deserved their own moment because they governed this household's time more completely than anything else. A Tudor family did not own a clock. Mechanical clocks existed, but they were luxury items found in the homes of the wealthy and in public towers. For everyone else, the church bell was the clock. It rang the hours, it announced services, It summoned people for extraordinary events, a fire, an invasion alarm, the death of a monarch. Different peals had different meanings that anyone who had grown up in the village could read without being told, and when the bells went silent, people noticed. When Henry VIII began dissolving the monasteries between 1536 and 1540, and the dissolution teams moved through the countryside stripping lead from roofs, and glass from windows and bells from towers, sometimes the bell was gone for years before anything returned to that tower. Villages that had heard the same set of bells for generations suddenly heard nothing. The silence was not abstract. It was physically audibly present in the daily life of the community, filling the space where the hours used to be marked. The dissolution of the monasteries. This is where the Reformation stopped being theology and became something you could touch. Between 1536 and 1540, Henry VIII's chief administrator, Thomas Cromwell, directed the closure of over 800 religious houses across England, monasteries, priories, abbeys, convents. The Crown seized their lands, stripped their valuables, dispersed their communities. Abbot Richard Whiting of Glastonbury refused to surrender his abbey and was executed on the abbey's own hill. The Abbot of Reading was hanged at his own gate. In the years that followed, parts of England looked as contemporaries described it, as though a foreign army had passed through. The ruins were visible, and vast buildings the size of cathedrals standing empty, stripped of everything that could be carried away. 20 years after the dissolution, the Venetian ambassador described the English landscape as much disfigured by the ruins of a multitude of churches and monasteries. But the ruins were not the worst of it for ordinary people. The monasteries had been among many other things the welfare state. They had operated hospitals. They had given alms to the poor, distributed food to travellers, run schools for children who could not afford other education. Before the dissolution, monasteries across England collectively distributed an estimated £6,500 per year in alms, a modest sum relative to their total wealth, but a vital safety net for communities that had no other organised poor relief. The levels of charitable giving in England that existed before the dissolution only recovered to their previous levels around 1580. 40 years of gap. 40 years during which the poor who had depended on those networks, the travellers, the widows, the sick, the orphaned found themselves without what had always been there, the pilgrimage of grace. In 1536, the largest popular uprising in Tudor England, involving perhaps 30,000 people, marching through the north, cited the lost monasteries explicitly among its grievances. These were not reformers or Protestants. They were ordinary men and women who had watched something they depended on be removed from the world they knew, and they wanted it back. Here is a question that goes to the heart of what the Reformation felt like from inside an ordinary household. When your family priest, who'd been saying Mass in Latin every Sunday for as long as you could remember, when he was suddenly replaced by a service in English with the Latin gone, and the candles gone and the statues whitewashed over, did it feel like progress? Or did it feel like someone had rearranged all the furniture in the dark? The historian Christopher Hay argues with considerable evidence that the English Reformation was not the popular groundswell of Protestant enthusiasm that later Protestant tradition wanted it to be. It was for a significant portion of the English population imposed from above by royal decree, with the people at the bottom of the social order, following along sometimes grudgingly, sometimes with genuine confusion, sometimes with quiet resistance because they had no other option. Within a single century, the people of this household were expected to abandon the Pope's authority and accept the king as head of the church. Henry VIII strip their parish churches of images, candles, and colour, and accept Protestant theology. Edward VI return to Catholicism, restore the Pope's authority, and accept Mary I as the Reformers' nightmare. Mary I, then shift again to a Protestant settlement that was deliberately ambiguous enough to accommodate those who had survived the previous 3 reigns. Elizabeth I. This is not a theological description. It is a description of what it felt like to grow up in England during the 16th century. Your religion changed by royal decree at least 4 times, and the penalty for being found on the wrong side of whatever the current version was could be at its most extreme execution. Elizabeth I's famous remark that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls was not just tolerance. It was an exhausted pragmatism. By the end of the century, enough people had died on enough scaffolds for enough variants of the Christian faith that someone in charge finally decided to stop trying to control what people actually believed, as long as they attended the right services and kept their doubts to themselves. But running through all of this underneath the official religion, underneath the imposed changes threading through the daily prayers and the saints' days and the candlelit kitchens, was something else entirely. The cunning folk. Every village in England had them. A woman who knew which herbs eased a fever, yes, but also which words said over a sick child in a certain way might help. A man who could find a lost object or identify who had cursed your cattle. These were not fringe figures operating in defiance of religion. They were woven into the same fabric. The parish churchwardens in Thatcham in 1583 sent for a cunning woman when the communion cloth was stolen, using magic effectively to recover a sacred object. Astrology was practiced at every level of society, from the humblest household consulting the almanac to Elizabeth I herself consulting the mathematician and astrologer John Dee about the auspicious date for her coronation. Comets were read as portents. The flight of certain birds meant certain things. A hare crossing your path as you left for market was an omen worth taking seriously enough to turn back and try again the next day. This was not ignorance. This was a worldview in which the natural and the supernatural were not separate categories but continuous ones. In a world where illness could strike without warning, and the harvest could fail, and a child you loved could be dead by morning, the desire to find patterns to read, signs to have some means of anticipating or deflecting the arbitrary cruelties of existence. This was not stupidity. It was grief management. It was the human need to believe that the world has a legible order, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. The strict Protestant reformers who tried to stamp out the cunning folk, the charms, the protective rhymes whispered over sick children, they were trying to remove something that people used for actual psychological survival. And they largely failed for the same reason that the attempt always fails. You cannot legislate away the need for meaning. Here is the thing about the Tudor religious experience that I keep returning to, the thing that makes it feel most like ours, even across 5 centuries of distance. The people in this house were not naive. They were not simply credulous recipients of whatever belief system was handed to them from above. They were negotiators, pragmatists. They held simultaneously the official religion of whatever the current monarch happened to be, the older practices their grandparents had taught them, the folk knowledge that had governed the household for generations, and a private set of beliefs that may or may not have mapped neatly onto any of the above. Elizabeth I said she would not make windows into men's souls. She was right not to, partly because nobody could have survived the view. The souls of ordinary Tudor people were complicated, layered, contradictory things, full of old devotions and new obligations and private fears that no official theology had ever quite addressed. They lit candles for saints they were no longer supposed to believe in. They whispered charms over sick children in the same breath as the Lord's Prayer. They attended the New English service every Sunday, and kept a small carving of the Virgin in a drawer where the visitors were unlikely to look. Not because they were dishonest, because they were human, and the human heart makes its own accommodations with the divine regardless of what the law says. There is a moment that captures all of this for me. a single image. In the mid-16th century across England, the interior walls of old churches were whitewashed. The medieval paintings that had covered those walls for generations, images of saints' scenes from Scripture, the vivid visual theology that had taught the faith to people who could not read, were painted over. Gone. Replaced by written texts, often scriptural verses in plain black letters on white. It was a theological statement. Images were idolatry. The word was what mattered. But in the years that followed, something interesting happened. In many churches, the whitewash slowly began to thin and crack and lift. And through it, very gradually, the old paintings began to reappear. The saints came back. Not because anyone had deliberately restored them, but because the whitewash had never gone all the way through, and time, being patient, had its own way with the wall. I think about that image sometimes when I think about what the Reformation did to ordinary English people. It went over the surface. It changed the official story. But underneath, in the walls of the house and the habits of the household, the older layers were still there, patient, waiting. The faith that governed this house was not one thing. It was everything at once. The bell, the prayer, the charm, the candle burned in secret, the saint whose feast day structured the rhythm of the week, the God who might or might not be watching every moment, all of it braided together into something that held this household upright against the particular darkness of living in a century that kept changing the rules about what it meant to be saved. And the clothing they put on every morning when they went out into that world, the layers, the constraints, the fierce social politics encoded in the colour of a ribbon, or the quality of a hem that is its own story. One we have been meaning to tell for a while. Because in Tudor England, what you wore was not a personal choice. It was a declaration, a legal document, a position statement that the law had an opinion about. And the lengths people went to negotiate around those rules, the vanity, the creativity, the occasional wild defiance, is one of the more delightful chapters of this entire year inside the house. Getting dressed in Tudor England was not a private act. It never was, really. From the moment you put on your first garment in the morning to the moment you walked out your door into the street, every choice you made, every colour, every fabric, every cut and trim and accessory was a public statement. And in Tudor England, some of those statements were legally mandated, some were legally prohibited, and a few people went to prison for getting it wrong. Let us start with the law, because the law is where Tudor clothing gets genuinely strange. The Sumptuary laws, also called the Statutes of Apparel, were not new to the Tudor period. They had existed in various forms since medieval England, attempting to regulate personal expenditure and maintain visible social hierarchy through the control of dress. But the Tudors took this tradition and turned it into something of an art form. By the time of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the legislation was so detailed, so granular, so obsessively specific about who could wear what and under what circumstances that reading through it feels less like legal history and more like someone's very anxious fever dream. Only the royal family could wear purple silk. Not dark red, not crimson purple. This was absolute. Dukes and marquesses could wear cloth of gold, but only in their coats and doublets, and only if it cost no more than £5 per square yard, a sum that was, to be fair, already astronomical for most people. Earls and above could wear sable fur. Barons and above could wear cloth of silver or satin. A lord or a knight of the garter was permitted to wear imported wool. Nobody below a certain rank could wear velvet in crimson, scarlet or blue, and this was just the nobility. Further down the social scale, the rules proliferated in every direction. Citizens and merchants earning less than £20 per year were forbidden from wearing silk entirely. Those earning between £20 and £100 could wear limited forms of silk, but nothing more elaborate. Officials were appointed specifically to inspect clothing in public and determine whether what they saw was compliant, One man, Richard Warwin, was actually imprisoned for wearing what a contemporary account described as a monstrous and outrageous pair of hose. I want to linger on that phrase for a moment. Monstrous and outrageous. He was imprisoned for his trousers. Now here is the thing about the sumptuary laws that historians generally agree on: they did not really work. They were passed with great ceremonial seriousness, reissued by multiple monarchs, revised and expanded, and largely ignored by the people they were aimed at, particularly the rising merchant class, whose growing wealth gave them both the means and the desire to dress in ways that the law said were above their station. Elizabeth I passed particularly detailed sumptuary legislation in 1574 explicitly in response to what she and her advisers perceived as the dangerous blurring of visible social distinctions by newly rich merchants who were dressing like the gentry. The anxiety behind the law was real and specific. If you could not tell at a glance who was noble and who was not, the entire visual language of hierarchy collapsed. The whole system depended on being able to read a person's social position from across the room. The penalty for violations under the 1,574 laws was a fine of £10 per day and 3 months in prison. £10 per day. For a merchant, for a craftsman's wife, this was a ruinous sum. And still, people flouted it. People being people. Let me take you through a morning, because the getting dressed process in Tudor England is one of those things that sounds simple until you actually map it out layer by layer, and then it becomes quietly extraordinary. For a woman of middling status, not a great noblewoman with ladies-in-waiting to dress her, but also not a labourer whose wardrobe consisted of 2 practical garments, the morning routine began with the smock. This was the linen shift worn directly against the skin, the base layer the garment that was washed most frequently, precisely because it absorbed the body's sweat before it reached the outer clothes. We discussed this chemistry earlier, the linen that kept Tudor people cleaner than the outer garments would suggest. Over the smock went stockings tied above the knee with a garter, then petticoats for warmth, then for a woman of any pretension to style a farthingale, that remarkable invention originally brought to England by Catherine of Aragon from Spain, which was essentially a framework of wooden or willow hoops that created a structural underskirt to support the weight and shape of everything above it. The early Spanish farthingale gave skirts a conical bell-shaped silhouette. By Elizabeth I's later reign, the French farthingale had evolved into something even more remarkable, a wheel-shaped frame that jutted straight out from the hips, sometimes measuring several feet across, creating a flat drum-like platform around the wearer's body. You could not really sit comfortably while wearing it. You could not pass through a narrow doorway without turning sideways. You could not move quickly. The farthingale was in a very literal sense a declaration that you were not the kind of woman who needed to pass quickly through narrow doorways or do anything that required rapid movement. Wealth embodied in architecture. Over the farthingale went a bumroll, a padded cushion tied around the hips to soften the transition between the frame and the outer garments. Then a corset-like bodice stiffened with buckram and sometimes wood. Then a kirtle, the underskirt visible through the gap at the front of the outer gown. Then the gown itself. Then in the outer layers a parlet covering the neckline, and then the ruff. The ruff. If there is a single garment in Tudor history that tells you everything you need to know about the period, it is the ruff. And the story of how it came to exist is almost too perfect as a metaphor for how fashion works. It began innocuously enough as a small ruffle at the drawstring neck of a woman's chemise. Just a glimpse of fine linen peeking above the neckline of a gown, a signal that the wearer's linen was fine, that it had been beautifully laundered, that beneath the outer garments lay quality that was worth noticing. Simple, practical, slightly vain. But once the competition began, and the competition began immediately, the ruffle grew. Then it grew more. Then the ruffle became a separate garment, entirely detachable, washable, starchable. It grew into something that required wire supports to hold its shape. By the later years of Elizabeth's reign, the most elaborate ruffs measured over a foot across the face, requiring so much starch that a specialist laundress was employed to care for a single ruff, washing it after every wearing, starching it, and pressing each pleat individually with special heated implements to restore its architecture. The ruff was a performance of leisure. It announced with absolute clarity that the wearer could not do anything that involved physical labour. You could not bend forward. You could not cook or carry or dig. You could not easily eat soup. The ruff was simultaneously a status symbol, a hygiene statement, a fashion object and a physical cage, and people adored it, competed over it, and spent fortunes maintaining it. Elizabeth I owned hundreds of ruffs. When she died, the inventory of her wardrobe ran to thousands of items. Gowns, sleeves, kirtles, petticoats, each piece a separate asset, each sleeve a separate purchase, each item recorded with the same careful attention that a modern estate would give to shares or property. Here is one of my favourite details about Tudor clothing, and I think about it every time I read about the period. The clothes were not washed. Not the outer clothes, not the gowns, the doublets, the kirtles, the heavy wool cloaks that people wore over everything. These were brushed, aired, carefully stored with herbs to discourage moths, and repaired when they wore thin. But they were almost never washed because the fabrics were too expensive and too fragile to survive the process, and because washing was understood to be for the linen underneath. This meant that the outer garment you owned in 1540 might still be worn in 1555, patched, altered, perhaps having had its sleeves replaced, or its trim refreshed, but fundamentally the same piece of cloth that had been acquired years before. Clothing was not a consumable, it was an investment. It was listed in wills alongside land and livestock. When a wealthy woman died, her gowns were not thrown away. They were passed to daughters, to nieces, to close friends, to servants as bequests of real economic value. One letter from 1538 survives in the Lisle Letters, a remarkable collection of correspondence from a noble household, of the period in which household members are tracking the fate of a French hood that had belonged to one woman and was passed to another. And as for Mrs. Anne's French hood my Lady Sussex had, and Mrs. Catherine gave hers to Mrs. Parr, 3 women, 1 hood carefully noted, because the hood was worth noting. We throw away clothes. Our Tudor counterparts would have found that genuinely bewildering. I want to stop and ask you something. Do you own something you never wear because you cannot quite bring yourself to get rid of it? A coat that belonged to someone, a dress you had for a particular occasion, something that carries more weight than fabric. The Tudor relationship with clothing was like that, but extended to almost everything. Because fabric was expensive and time-consuming to make, and because clothing was literally the most visible statement you made about who you were in the world, you did not discard it. You transformed it, passed it down, wore it in layers, repaired it until it was beyond repair, and then repurposed the usable cloth into something else. The practical and the sentimental were not separate impulses. They were the same impulse operating in the same economy. The men's clothing of this period deserves its own moment because it has been unfairly overlooked in the shadow of the farthingale and the ruff. Henry VIII himself provides the most spectacular case study. The iconic image of Henry legs apart, massive, square-shouldered, taking up as much space as a human body possibly can, is inseparable from his clothing. The padded doublet that broadened his shoulders, the quilted codpiece that announced certain things about his vitality and authority with a level of directness that modern fashion has mostly abandoned. The slashed fabric of his sleeves deliberately cut to reveal contrasting lining beneath in a technique that somehow managed to be simultaneously destructive and ostentatious. Henry VIII's clothing was not fashion. It was a political manifesto worn on the body, Everything about it communicated power, aggression, virility, abundance. The king who was worried about his succession, who desperately needed to project masculine authority, dressed himself in armour that was not armour-thick, structural padded, immovable. He was performing strength even when his legs were ulcerated, and he needed a walking frame. The courtiers around him followed his lead because that was how courtly fashion worked. You watched what the person above you wore and you echoed it, scaled to your rank, careful, never to outshine, but always trying to match the general direction. Down in the village and the market town, the clothing conversation was happening differently. Ordinary people could not afford silk or velvet, could not legally wear them even if they could. What they had was wool, and wool, it turns out, was not the drab uniform experience that most of us imagine. Natural dyes produced a surprisingly wide range of colours, madder for red woad, for blue weld, for yellow. The idea that ordinary Tudor people dressed exclusively in muddy browns and greys is, according to textile historians, largely a modern misconception. But ordinary clothing was designed above all else for survival, durability, warmth, ease of movement for the work that had to be done. A woman working in the fields could not manage a farthingale. She wore fewer layers, simpler cuts, an apron over everything. Her clothing moved with her. It was not making statements about her leisure. And yet, and this is the part that I find quietly remarkable, even ordinary people saved their best clothes for Sundays and feast days. They had good wool, and everyday wool, good linen, and everyday linen. The best was brought out for the occasions that required it, for church, for market, for weddings and funerals, for the days when you stood among your community and were seen. The desire to be seen, well, to dress for occasions, to use clothing as a way of marking what mattered. This cuts across every income level in every century. The form changes. The specific objects change. The impulse does not. One final thing about Tudor clothing that I want to leave you with. It was all held together with pins. Not buttons, not zippers, not hooks and eyes. In most cases, though, those existed too. Pins. Sharp brass delicate pins that were expensive enough to be specifically purchased with household money, which is where the phrase pin money comes from, as we talked about earlier. The entire construction of a well-dressed Tudor woman's outfit depended on hundreds of small, carefully placed pins that kept the detachable sleeves attached to the bodice, the ruff secured to the neckline, the various layers of skirt in their proper configuration. And so the famous demure composure of Tudor noble women in portraits, that stillness, that careful, measured quality of movement was not entirely dignity or modesty or courtly training. A significant portion of it was the practical awareness that somewhere in the architecture of their clothing a pin was lying in wait. They moved carefully because they had to, because one wrong turn and the whole elegant construction would remind them very sharply that they were flesh and fabric and small, sharp objects all at once. The cloth has been laid out. The pins are set. We're nearly at the end of this year inside the house, and the story that remains the most quietly astonishing one of all is what happened when the year finally ended. Not the calendar year, but the year of a life. What happened when someone in this household died? How did they understand that crossing? What rituals attended it? What was kept? What was left behind? And what can the way a household faced death tell us about everything we have watched unfold in this house over the last several hours? The final rooms of this story are the most intimate ones. Come in quietly. Death in Tudor England was not hidden. It didn't happen in a hospital behind closed curtains managed by professionals announced afterward, at a careful distance from the household's daily rhythms. It happened here, in this house, in this bedroom we have spent time in, with the family gathered with the neighbours, summoned with the priest travelling from the parish church to administer what the church had always administered and the household had always expected. Death was domestic. It was communal. It was in a very specific sense the final performance of a life that had been lived communally from beginning to end. and for a people who lived with its proximity in a way that we no longer do, who had lost children, who had watched the sweating sickness pass through a street, who had seen a harvest fail, and a winter become something closer to a reckoning. The art of dying well was not a metaphor. It was a skill, learnable, practicable, taken seriously by every person who hoped to exit this world in a state of sufficient grace. First, let us correct something that trips almost everyone up. When people say that Tudor life expectancy was around 35 years, they are technically correct and practically misleading at the same time. The number exists because of the catastrophic mortality rates among infants and young children that we've talked about throughout this story. Those deaths dragged the average down so severely that it ceased to function as a meaningful description of what adulthood actually looked like. A person who survived childhood, who made it through the dangerous first years, the fevers of early life, the close calls of adolescence, could reasonably expect to live into their 50s or 60s. Some lived considerably longer. John of Gaunt reached 60. His father, Edward III, died at 65. The ordinary people of Tudor England were not routinely collapsing in middle age. They were farming, trading, raising families, growing old in recognisable ways. What was different was not the potential length of life, but its constant proximity to interruption. The gap between a healthy 50-year-old and a dead one could be measured in the Tudor world in days if plague came, if the sweating sickness returned, if an infected wound progressed the wrong direction. The margin was thin, not because people were fragile, but because the safety nets we now take for granted simply did not exist. This awareness, this lived, embodied understanding that the margin was thin gave the Tudor approach to death its particular flavour. They did not despair about it. They organised around it. The organising principle was what theologians of the period called the good death, and this concept deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it shaped everything about how dying was handled in an ordinary Tudor household. The late medieval church had developed over centuries an entire literature of guidance on how to die well. The Ars Moriendi, literally the art of dying, began as a series of texts produced in the early 15th century, partly in response to the devastation of the Black Death, which had killed so many priests that the dying often could not access clergy when they needed them most. These manuals were designed to fill that gap, to tell the dying person what to expect, how to resist the temptations that beset a soul at its most vulnerable moment, and how to depart this world in a state of peace and readiness. The temptations the manuals warned against were remarkably specific: despair, impatience, spiritual pride, greed, and clinging to earthly possessions. Each was addressed in sequence with prayers and responses prepared in advance, so that the dying person or a family member speaking on their behalf, if they had lost the ability to speak, could navigate the final passage according to a script that the Church had already blessed. Illustrated versions of the Ars Moriendi circulated widely, showing demons crouching at the bedside, whispering doubts, offering bags of gold, appealing to family ties that would keep the soul earthbound, and angels leaning in to encourage the counter-moves, the surrender to grace, the final trusting relinquishment of everything this person had accumulated, loved, fought for, and held. The deathbed in this framework was not simply the end of a life. It was the culminating event of a life, the moment when everything that had come before was either confirmed or forfeited depending on how well the dying person navigated this last passage. A bad death was not simply one that was painful. A bad death was one that happened without preparation. Sudden death from accident, from violence, from a disease that killed too quickly for confession, and the last rites to be administered was genuinely feared in a way that goes beyond the obvious fear of dying itself. To die without confession was to carry all one's unaddressed sins into the afterlife. To die without receiving the sacrament of extreme unction was to enter purgatory in a state of maximum disadvantage. Purgatory. The belief that most souls would spend some period of suffering after death being purged of the stains of earthly sin before they could enter heaven was not a peripheral doctrine for ordinary Tudor people. It was as real to them as the house they lived in, and considerably more concerning since the duration and severity of purgatorial suffering was understood to be related to the spiritual state in which you arrived. A well-prepared death minimized the debt. An unprepared one left it enormous. This is why the ghost tradition of Tudor England, those stories of restless spirits returning to haunt the living, so often centered on people who had died badly. The ghost of Hamlet's father unable to rest because he'd been murdered before he could confess is not a poetic invention. It is a theological condition, the soul of a man who died with spiritual debts, unpaid, unable to proceed, condemned to walk the earth until those debts could somehow be addressed. Tudor people believed in ghosts in part because Tudor theology gave those ghosts a specific and coherent reason to exist. Let us walk through what actually happened in this house when someone was dying. When it became clear that a household member was unlikely to recover, the first act was to send for the priest. Before the Reformation, this was absolutely urgent and non-negotiable. The priest would hear a full confession, the final accounting of a life all sins remembered and declared all forgiveness sought, and then administer extreme unction, the anointing with oil that the Church recognized as one of the 7 sacraments, a seal of grace over a departing soul. After the Reformation swept away extreme unction as a sacrament, Edward VI's government abolished it. In 1552 the priest still came, but the role was different. Instead of the formal sacramental sequence, there was prayer communion and the encouragement to repent and trust in God's mercy. The destination was the same, a soul prepared. The route had changed. As the person lay dying, the immediate family was present. So were neighbours in many cases. The deathbed was not private, it was witnessed. There were practical reasons for this. Witnesses to a dying person's last wishes could testify about the will and the distribution of property, but there were spiritual and social reasons too. The community gathered to send one of its members forward. This was their obligation, their participation in the passage. You did not die alone. And when the death came, when the breath stopped and the body was still, the church bell rang. Not once, but in a sequence that conveyed specific information to everyone within earshot. The pattern of tolling told the parish that someone had died, and traditional variations in how the bells were rung could indicate whether the deceased was a man or a woman, and sometimes their approximate age. Every person in the village, from the blacksmith to the priest, to the woman in the next house, heard that bell and knew what it meant. The community was informed not by word of mouth, but by sound, the same bells that had marked every hour of this person's life, marking its end. The body remained in the house until the funeral. This is one of those details that modern people often find jarring, but it is worth understanding on its own terms. The body at home laid out with sweet-smelling herbs strewn over it, watched through the night by family members in what was called a wake. This was not negligence or poverty. It was presence. It was the community's way of honouring the passage of staying with the person through the transition of not abandoning them to the anonymous management of strangers. There was a practice that persisted in some areas that I find genuinely extraordinary, the sin eater. When someone died, the family would take a piece of bread and beer and pass them over the body before presenting them to a hired individual, the sin eater, who would eat and drink on behalf of the deceased. The belief was that in consuming these things, the sin eater took onto themselves the accumulated spiritual debt of the dead person, freeing that soul for a lighter journey through purgatory. The sin eater was by necessity a person who had already so thoroughly consumed the sins of others that their own spiritual state was considered, I imagine, fairly well beyond rescue anyway. They occupied a position that was simultaneously necessary and untouchable, paid, fed, and regarded with a mixture of gratitude and deep unease. This practice was not mainstream Catholic doctrine. It was popular folk belief blending with formal religion, the way folk belief always blends with formal religion, filling the gaps that institutional theology left open, serving the emotional needs that official rites did not quite reach. The will deserves its own discussion because in Tudor England a will was not primarily a financial document. It was a spiritual one. The opening clauses of virtually every Tudor will from the grandest nobleman to the humblest craftsman followed the same essential structure. First, the declaration of faith, a statement committing the soul to God, to Christ, to the saints. Then the acknowledgement of the body's mortality and the soul's destination. Then the arrangements for burial, which church, which location within the churchyard or the church itself, which prayers and masses were to be said, which candles were to be burned, what alms were to be distributed to the poor in the deceased's name. Only after all of that spiritual accounting did the document turn to the distribution of earthly property. Wills were in this sense the final act of piety, the last opportunity to invest in one's spiritual future, to demonstrate charity, to settle debts, both financial and spiritual. A person who died without making a will did not just leave their property in legal confusion, they left their spiritual affairs unattended, which was in the terms of the period genuinely alarming. Do you ever think about what you would leave behind, not financially? I mean in the broader sense. What would you want said? What would you want done? What would the shape of your life look like, summed up in the accounting of its final hours? I ask because the Tudor approach to dying, as alien as some of its specific mechanics are to modern sensibility, answers those questions with a seriousness that I think we have mostly lost. The preparation was constant because the proximity of death was constant. The skill of dying well was cultivated throughout a life precisely because you could not count on having time to cultivate it at the end. There is a phrase from Peter Marshall, one of the historians who has written most thoughtfully about death in this period, that has stayed with me. He describes the Tudor deathbed as communal concern, something that spread outward from the dying individual to the family, the parish, the wider community. You did not die as an individual unit of one. You died as a node in a network, the network tending to you, watching, praying, sending you forward with everything it could offer. Whether or not you believe in what came after, there is something in that collective attention, that refusal to let a person die alone and unwitnessed, that feels like a form of dignity we have in our tidying of death away from the domestic and communal sphere somewhat lost. The funeral itself, when it came, was another communal occasion. The body was carried to the church in a coffin if the family could afford one. For the poor, and most people in Tudor England were poor in the ways that mattered most, the coffin was borrowed for the procession, and the person was buried in their shroud. The church bell rang again. The priest spoke. The body was committed to the churchyard, to the consecrated ground that the community had maintained for generations, in which the person's ancestors very likely already lay. After the Reformation, as the old prayers for the dead fell away, and masses for souls in purgatory were declared theologically invalid, the funeral became something slightly different, less about what could still be done for the dead, and more about what the living could take from the moment. The funeral sermon, once a relatively rare formality, became increasingly important in the Protestant settlement, an occasion to instruct the congregation about the life just lost and the theological truths it illustrated. The living in this new framework could not pray their beloved out of purgatory, but they could hear in the telling of that life a story about how to live their own. And so after the funeral the house continued, the fire was lit, the pot was placed over it, the children were fed, the animals were tended, the work that had never stopped, that would never stop as long as there were people in this house who needed to eat, to sleep, to keep warm through the long English winter, continued exactly as before. The absence was real. The grief was real. The wills and the funeral customs and the prayers and the sin-eaters and the tolling bells were all real attempts to address that realness, to give it shape and ritual and meaning. But the house went on, and there is something in that going on in the way a household absorbs loss and continues its daily rhythms, in the way people who have lost everything get up and make breakfast anyway. That is perhaps the most historically consistent thing about human beings across any century you care to name. We have spent a long time inside this house now. We have walked its rooms in every season, at every hour, through fire and birth and illness and faith and death. We have met people whose names we do not know, and some whose names history happened to record. And the final thing this house has to tell us, the last fire of the year, the last candle of the evening, is something about what we have learned by being here, about what this household understood that we've forgotten, and about what they could not have imagined that we take entirely for granted. That is where we are heading. The last room, the one that does not appear in any floor plan but exists in every house that has ever held a life inside its walls. Stay with me. The fire is low now. It has been burning since before sunrise, the way it always does in this house, the way it always did for every household we've moved through together over these past hours. And as the day draws in, and the light fades at the windows, and the household begins its familiar, practiced, unhurried retreat into the evening, I want to sit with you here for a little while longer before we go, because I think this house has something left to say. We've spent a year inside these walls, more or less. We watch the fire being coaxed back to life in the dark at 4 a.m. We trace the fingers of a woman who never stopped working, spinning thread by the glow of a rushlight, while the day completed itself. We learned that the bed was not private, that the bedroom was a public space, that children went to bed in the same room as their parents and thought nothing of it. We tasted the pottage argued with the sumptuary laws and sat quietly beside a deathbed that the whole community attended. We stood in the rush-covered room while Erasmus complained about the smell, and we understood that he was probably being a little dramatic, and somewhere in all of that, in the mundane and the strange and the quietly heartbreaking and the occasionally hilarious, a picture assembled itself. Not the picture of kings and courts and famous names, something much quieter and much older than that. A picture of what it actually looked like to be alive in a particular place at a particular time, with a particular set of tools and constraints and beliefs, and other people you were bound to by geography and obligation and love. Here is the honest question this house leaves me with. What did these people have that we do not? I want to be careful with this question because the temptation is to romanticize, and romanticizing would be dishonest. Tudor life was hard in ways that are not glamorous and do not invite nostalgia. The infant mortality rate was real. The winter cold was real. The fear of the sweating sickness was real and rational. The legal subordination of women was a structure that crushed people under its weight every single day. Nobody should want to go back. And yet, there are things that house held that I notice when I look around my own world and find missing. The first is proximity. Not just to other people, though that too, but to the basic processes of life. The food came from the garden or the market or the salted barrel, and the person who ate it had usually been involved in producing it. The cloth that kept you warm had passed through the hands of someone you knew. The house you lived in had been built with materials that could be seen from any direction. There was a chain of connection between a person and the world they inhabited that was short enough to be felt. We've extended that chain to the point where most of us cannot trace it at all. Our food arrives from distribution centres we have never visited, made in processes we have never seen by people we will never meet. The same is true of our clothing, our furniture, our light, our warmth. The convenience is real, and I would not trade it lightly. But something was also lost in the extension, some practical understanding of what a life costs in labour and material and seasonal luck. The second thing Tudor people had was communal embeddedness. We talked about this in various rooms throughout this house, but it bears saying plainly these people were never alone in the way we are alone. They were never entirely solitary in their labours, their griefs, their celebrations, their deaths. The neighbourhood participated. The parish witnessed. The household itself was a collective enterprise that required the sustained effort and presence of everyone in it, and that requirement, as demanding as it was, also meant that everyone in it mattered to the daily functioning of the whole. The historian Bill Bryson, in his wonderful book about the history of private life, notes that the word comfort only acquired its modern meaning, that sense of ease and pleasurable repose, in the 18th century. Before that, comfort meant support. It meant the presence of others in difficulty. To comfort someone was to stand beside them, not to provide them with a warm blanket. I think about that every time I use the word. The third thing Tudor people had, and this one is the hardest to name precisely, was a different relationship with time. Not a better one, not a simpler one, just a different one. Their time was structured by the rhythm of daylight and seasons and the church bell and the liturgical calendar, rather than by schedules and notifications. The day had a shape that was given from outside rather than negotiated from within. There was no meeting rescheduled at 11 p.m. by email. There was no Sunday morning that could plausibly be taken up with work if the work felt urgent enough. The boundaries were in their way more permeable, but also in their way more real. I'm not arguing for a return to any of this. I'm not sure the bell-governed day is what any of us actually wants. But I do notice, when I let myself notice, that the complete erasure of any natural structure to time the flattening of all hours into equally available work opportunity has produced something that Tudor people would have found deeply strange. They would have understood being tired, they would have understood being hungry, they would have understood being cold and afraid and uncertain about the future. But they might not have understood the particular exhaustion of someone who has everything convenient and nothing to hold on to. There is a final thing this house tells us, and it is perhaps the most unexpected one. The people who lived here were not naive. They were not primitive. They were not waiting for us to arrive and improve them. They were fully intelligent, fully imaginative, fully human adults, navigating a world that was by many measures far more demanding than ours, and they were doing it with a kind of practical creativity that we have mostly replaced with purchase. Something broke. You repaired it. Something ran out, you made more. Someone was sick. You knew which plants helped and which did not, because you had been learning that knowledge since childhood. The relationship between need and response was direct and personal, and required competence. And this is what strikes me sitting here by this fire that has been burning since before the first word of this story. The intelligence required to run a Tudor household was extraordinary. The woman at the centre of it, the one whose name we still do not know, the one who brewed and spun and healed and planted and preserved and prayed and raised children, and sent them away, and watched some of them die, and got up the next morning and started the fire again. She was remarkable, unremarkably remarkable in the way that most extraordinary human competence is ordinary, from the inside, invisible from the outside, essential to everyone who depended on it. History forgot her. History forgets most people like her. But she kept this house alive, and every house like hers, and every person who grew up warm and fed and eventually sent out into the world to make their own fires, they carried something forward from her hands that they did not know the name of. Something that persists 500 years later in the way people who have never met manage to help each other through winters that are not literal but feel just as cold. Let me ask you one final question before we close the door. If you had to live 1 year inside a Tudor home, not the palace version, not Henry VIII's Hampton Court with its 55-room kitchen and 200 staff, but the real one, the craftsman's house, the farmer's cottage, the ordinary busy smoky shared prayer, filled beer-drinking pin, pricked rush-covered communal life of a working household in the 1540s, how long do you think you would survive before you genuinely miss something essential from the world you came from? And what surprises you about what that something might be? I find the answer I give myself changes depending on what kind of day I have had. Some days I think 3 weeks and I would be doing fine. Some days I think I would miss hot water within the hour. But there is one thing I am fairly confident I would not miss, or at least not miss in the way I might expect. I think I would not miss being alone. Because the one thing that house almost never was across every room and every hour and every season we walked through together was empty. It was full. Constantly messily, sometimes suffocatingly full of people who needed things from each other and provided things to each other and were in the most basic and physical sense present for each other in a way that the convenient distance of modern life has made it very easy not to be. That, I think, is what the Tudor house ultimately teaches. Not that their world was better, not that ours should look more like theirs, but that the things humans actually need to feel like humans, the fire, the shared meal, the hand on the shoulder in difficulty, the witness at the beginning and end of a life, those things have not changed. We have just built more sophisticated architectures for avoiding them. And sometimes in the quiet hours, in the second sleep as it were, when the house is still and the fire is low and the day has finally stopped demanding things, it is worth noticing what we have gained and what we have traded away, and deciding slowly and with the full weight of that knowledge whether the trade was worth it. I want to say thank you, genuinely. If you made it here, if you travelled through that fire and that dark bedroom and that impossible rough, and that beloved unnamed woman's year of invisible labour, and that deathbed attended by the entire parish, then you did something that history asks of us very rarely. You paid attention to the quiet places, to the rooms that do not appear in the official accounts, to the lives that powered everything and left almost nothing behind except the faint, patient impression of human hands in whatever survived. This was never just a story about Tudor England. It was a story about what it has always meant to live in a house with other people, to keep a fire going, to be responsible for things that matter, to love what you have built, even knowing it will not last, to show up every morning and do what needs to be done. That story is 500 years old. It is also, if you let it be about today, about this evening, about whatever fire you're keeping alive in your own life right now. Keep it burning, and if you found yourself somewhere in this house tonight, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the rush-covered room with the herbs and the candles and the prayers, then come back. Because there are other houses waiting, other centuries with their own particular genius and their own particular losses, other ordinary people whose daily lives contain more mystery and more instruction than most official history ever bothered to record. The next story is already taking shape. I cannot wait to share it with you. Rest well tonight.